Chapter 1948. While Zhang Yan was pondering, he suddenly felt two very weak waves of mana coming towards him. He turned around and saw that it was the two Taoists who had joined forces with him. Just now, when Taoist Zhang Yuan came to find him, he must have used some kind of method to conceal his magic power. Apart from him, no one else had seen him come. This method was very profound and seemed to be able to be used for a long time. With his current cultivation, he was still unable to fully understand it. He retracted some of his magic power, and a moment later, the two Taoists appeared in front of him. Because they had been held up by Patriarch Yao Han and the other two, the two Taoists were not in their true forms, but a shadow. After the two greeted him, the Taoist standing on the left said, "Our true bodies are currently comprehending the creation essence and can't leave for a while. I hope you won't blame us for not being able to come here personally." Zhang Yan knew about this and said, "It's fine." The Taoist on the right said, "We came to find you today because we saw you defeat Yu Lu and the others. Your cultivation is profound, so we would like to ask you for a favor." Zhang Yan asked, "What do you mean?" The Taoist on the left said, "Fellow Taoist, if you ever meet the three of them here again, just let us know and we'll come to your aid. If we meet them again, we'd like to ask for your help as well. What do you think?" The Taoist on the left said, "Of course, this is not a promise of an alliance. If something happens, it's up to you whether you go or not." After Zhang Yan defeated Ancestor Yao Han and the other two Taoists, the two Taoists had already given up on the idea of finding the creation essence from Zhang Yan. Instead, they wanted to form a good relationship with him. They didn't use any fancy words and just laid everything out in the open. It could be considered as being open and honest. Zhang Yan thought about it and understood that this was only a verbal agreement and not a formal alliance. Therefore, if the two Taoists fought against Yao Han and the other two Taoists, he might not necessarily go to their aid. Naturally, if something happened to him, the two Taoists might not necessarily come to his aid. However, at least they had left a door for each other. He thought this was fine. No matter what the two Taoists' goal was, they had helped him this time, so he should return the favor. He said, "That's fine too." The Taoist on the left flipped his palm and produced a shimmering object. It was a fragment of the essence of creation. He said, "Fellow Taoist, I'm sure you have this. We're willing to exchange it for research. Is that possible?" Zhang Yan thought about it and agreed. He originally wanted to find out what was different about the other fragments. Since the other party was willing to exchange, he couldn't ask for more. With a wave of his sleeve, he sent the fragment beside him to the other party and took the one in the other party's hand. Since the two of them were only phantoms, he wasn't afraid of their tricks. His mind turned inward, and he felt that he had sunk into that empty place again. It was somewhat similar to what he had seen before, but there were also some new understandings. In just a moment, he seemed to understand some principles. When he examined it again, he found that his cultivation had improved out of nowhere. He was slightly surprised. From the looks of it, it was obvious that the more essence of creation he accumulated, the faster his cultivation would increase. However, this was not something he had cultivated himself. He was just reflecting the principles of the Great Tao onto himself. In other words, he might not really understand the principles of the Great Tao, but it was equivalent to him becoming a part of the Great Tao. But it was also because of this that he could temporarily avoid Wanzhen. When he really understood the principles, Wanzhen would catch up. It was only because he was one step ahead of Wanzhen that he had the chance to resolve it before that. But it was not hard to imagine that such a method would require him to maintain his cultivation at all times. Once he stagnated, Wanzhen could reflect in his mind at any time and tangle with him. He couldn't help but ponder in his heart. Even though the Tao of seeking external help could improve one's cultivation extremely quickly, it had a huge drawback as well. He needed to continuously seek the creation fragment, and if Wanzhen caught up with him, he would be dragged into a dangerous situation. Just using this method to seek Tao was not for him. Similar to him, the two Taoists only looked at the fragment he passed to them for a moment before they returned it. Zhang Yan rolled up his sleeve and kept it. He wasn't afraid that the other party would do anything to him. They were right in front of him and were within the range of his mana. Their every move couldn't be hidden from him. The Taoist on the right said, "If you have more creation fragments in your hands and are willing to exchange them, we will be waiting for you." Zhang Yan nodded. The two of them were satisfied that their wish was fulfilled. They believed that in the future, when the two sides worked together more and could trust each other, they might be able to use this method to exchange for the fortune essence behind Zhang Yan. This was far better than fighting to the death with him. After exchanging a few more words, the two of them took their leave. Before they parted, the Taoist on the left suddenly said, "I see that although your mana is strong, your cultivation is not complete. I would like to give you a piece of advice. In this world, the only way to comprehend Tao is to find the remnant essence of creation. Do not look for the unique technique." After saying that, the two of them bowed and disappeared. Zhang Yan's eyes flashed. Just now, this person was probably referring to a way to seek help from himself. Judging from Taoist Zhang Yuan's words, Taoist Zhang Yuan regarded self-seeking as an outsider. However, Yi Shiwen never believed anyone's words. Although Taoist Zhang Yuan had said that he wanted to help Yi Shiwen when he first showed up, it was only his side of the story. No one knew what he was thinking. Perhaps he had only come to show Yi Shiwen some face, or perhaps he wanted to lead Yi Shiwen to self-seeking. Although there were many details that he wanted to know, this was not a secret among the spirit refinement almighties. As the number of confrontations with his peers increased, even if he didn't tell him, he would find out about it sooner or later. He had no prejudice against seeking help from others and seeking help from himself. However, stubbornness was an obstacle to improving his cultivation. He couldn't keep it, so he had to kill it. In the past, those who passed this level all disappeared or went into hiding, so it was impossible to ask for help. He could only rely on himself to solve it. Fortunately, there was still a long way to go before he reached this level. He still had enough time to think of countermeasures. It seemed that there were many mysteries hidden in Bushutian. Now that the enemy had retreated, it seemed like he could open the door and return to the original world. However, just as he thought about it, he felt something and couldn't help but look in a certain direction. He immediately confirmed that Ancestor Yao Han was still spying on him, as if waiting for him to open the door. He knew that although this person had retreated in defeat, the battle was not truly over. This was because the sapling in Taoist Yu Qiu's hand was still there. As long as there was an opportunity, it might appear again, so he couldn't let his guard down. If that was the case, then he would need to do some concealment. Otherwise, it would be hard to know what kind of tricks he would come up with. He thought about it for a moment. In a situation where there was no outside help, he could only find a way to conceal himself. Fortunately, it wasn't that he didn't have a way. Just now, he had seen the power of this person's magic treasure. For example, the sapling in Taoist Yu Qiu's hand could be retracted and released at will. If he had such a treasure, it would be safer to protect the door. Now that he had a protective magic treasure, it wouldn't be difficult to block the covetous eyes of this person. The Tai golden bead was good at attacking, but it couldn't do anything about this, so he could only refine it. He looked down at the creation essence fragment in his hand. It was obviously not enough to comprehend unless he could find more. However, it was perfect for refining magic treasures. According to Taoist Zhang Yuan, even if a spirit refinement realm cultivator used a creation fragment to refine a magic treasure, 1 or 2 pieces would be enough unless absolutely necessary. This should be true. When he fought with Ancestor Yao Han and the other two, he clearly felt that their magic treasures weren't much better than the Tai golden bead. It was clear that they hadn't invested too much into it. At this moment, with a thought, under his observation, the fragment was like a flower bud that was closing. The brilliance actually began to slowly retract, and then it continued to shrink and collapse inwards. Finally, it gradually condensed into a crystal jade in the shape of a water drop. In an instant, it had turned into a magic treasure. However, when he did this, he noticed that the fragment didn't disappear but existed in the world in another way. He couldn't help but think in his heart as he looked at the jade droplet that had already transformed into a magic treasure. He thought to himself, in that case, could it be that this thing can be returned? But then he thought about it and realized that it wouldn't be so simple. Otherwise, Ancestor Yao Han and the others could refine the fragment in their hands and return it to its original appearance when they wanted to comprehend it. They didn't do that because they thought it was better to keep it in their hands. He felt that there was no need to think about this now, so with a thought, he created thousands of images in an instant. Each image was similar to Bushutian's original image. Then, with a shake of his sleeve, he threw the crystal jade down. In a trance, these images seemed to be covered by a layer and became blurry. Seeing that the arrangement was stable, he couldn't help but nod. The magic power of cultivators of the same generation had always been at odds with each other. With this treasure in front of him, even if the opponent's magic power tried to suppress him, he could deal with it in time. Moreover, if he encountered someone he couldn't handle, he could hide the images in advance. At this moment, Ancestor Yao Han was watching Zhang Yan's actions. He guessed that the latter would open the door for Bushutian. Seeing this, he frowned. There were many images, and they were all blurry. Moreover, they all looked the same. If they wanted to find the main door without alerting Zhang Yan, they would have to try them one by one. Daoist Yu Qiu shook his head and said, Daoist Zhang's method covered all the gaps. Unless we face him head-on again, we won't be able to enter. Ancestor Yao Han said solemnly, we underestimated him last time. Once we finish refining the treasure, we won't give him such a chance again. Chapter 1949. After Ancestor Yao Han and the other two retreated, they believed that the reason they were at a disadvantage was because Zhang Yan's sudden move caught them off guard. The other reason was that their treasures were all defensive. Apart from their own magic power, they had no other way to attack. Therefore, when they were at a disadvantage in the beginning, they could only fight with Zhang Yan. At that time, if they had an offensive weapon, they wouldn't be in such a passive position. Therefore, they were prepared to spare no expense and use a few fragments of the essence of creation to refine an offensive treasure that could make up for their shortcomings. Daoist Yu Qiu saw that Daoist Yu Lu was silent and seemed to be deep in thought. He asked, Daoist friend, did you think of something? Daoist Yu Lu looked up and said, just now, Daoist Zhang seems to be meeting with someone. Daoist Yu Qiu said, I saw it too. It should be those two. That's right, if they really join hands with Daoist Zhang, it will be troublesome. However, I don't think those two are willing to ally with Daoist Zhang. Although they don't know where Bushutian is, they are still after the treasure. Daoist Zhang is not a simple person, so he might not believe them. Ancestor Yao Han said, if they wanted to ally with us, they would have already been on the same side when we were fighting. That Daoist Zhang will not submit to those two after defeating us. Daoist Yu Qiu said, if those two sides fight, it will save me some effort. Unfortunately, he knew that this was most likely impossible. No matter which side it was, they would not rashly start a fight when they knew there was a foreign enemy outside. Daoist Yu Qiu said, it's not about that. Before meeting with those two, he went to that place with another person. His cultivation was slightly higher among the three, so he could vaguely sense Daoist Zhen Yuan's arrival, but he couldn't be completely sure. Another person. Elder Yao Han was slightly surprised, but Daoist Jade Leek would not speak without thinking. After pondering for a moment, they both remembered that when the modern world was created, there seemed to be an external force that entered the modern world, but it disappeared afterward. Looking at it now, it might be the person Jade Leek sensed. Just from the fact that he was able to conceal his own mana, this person was not simple. If he was using a magical treasure, then it would be fine. But if he was purely relying on his own abilities, then his cultivation was most likely above theirs. More importantly, they still didn't know what this person's intentions were. If Zhang Yan was alone, they would still have a chance to win. However, if he joined hands with someone of the same generation who was not weak, then their chances would be even slimmer. Ancestor Yao Han's expression was solemn. Where did this person come from? Daoist Yu Qiu performed the incantation and deduced for a moment before shaking his head. His foundation is unclear, so it's hard to deduce. Ancestor Yao Han thought for a moment and suddenly said, maybe it's that person with self-reliance. Taoist Yu Qiu thought for a moment and said, that is indeed possible. I see that Taoist Zhang's mana is strong, but his cultivation has not yet been cultivated. He has not yet decided on the path of seeking the Tao. If it is according to the external path, then it is very likely that he is trying to rope him in. However, none of us know that person's qi dynamic, so it is hard to judge. Taoist Yu Qiu said, if that Taoist Zhang really goes on the path of self-seeking, then it is actually a good thing. Bushutian is not something that he must seek, and the act of killing stubborn truth is even more difficult. If he gets entangled with each other and disappears without a trace, then there is no need for me to do anything. From their point of view, the so-called self-seeking was to believe that one could achieve the Tao. It was an art of giving wishes, and while it was feasible in theory, there were many obstacles that were difficult to overcome. If there was no other path, then it was worth a try. But with the Tao right in front of them, taking such a path would be neglecting the essentials and pursuing the trifles. Taoist Yu Qiu felt an indescribable fear and sighed, but if he doesn't go, then there will be more trouble. Taoist Yu Qiu also nodded. If stubborn truth replaced the original body, it would be the same as passing the test of understanding the truth. However, it would be the original body that would be destroyed. But one's personality could change over and over again, and such people were the most difficult to fathom. It was very likely that in order to seek their own Tao, they would make the choice to destroy all external paths. And Zhang Yan's methods were not ordinary. If his cultivation improved another level, then he would be even more difficult to deal with. Moreover, because of the previous conflict between them, they would most likely be targeted. Although the three of them were not necessarily afraid, it was likely that they would never have a day of peace. At this time, Patriarch Yao Han said, fellow Taoists, this is only speculation, and the truth may not be so. We will still act according to the previous steps. If that Taoist Zhang really wants to enter the Tao of self-seeking, then it will take a long time. Once my magic treasure is refined, we will immediately find him. If everything goes smoothly, we may be able to force him into eternal silence, and then there will be no need to worry about this. Taoist Yu Qiu thought for a moment and said, fellow Taoist is right. If that Taoist Zhang has really entered the Tao of self-seeking and even obtained the assistance of a person of this Tao, then there's no harm in us telling those two. I presume the two of them aren't willing to see such a figure nearby. After Taoist Zhang Yuan and Zhang Yan left, they gradually distanced themselves from the magic power, and then they almost separated. At this time, another world appeared in front of them. The other worlds were like a long river, flowing and flashing with life and death, but this one was like a piece of amber, stagnant and motionless. With a sway of his body, he entered it. Unexpectedly, he didn't sink his consciousness into it, but entered it with his body. Here, heaven and earth were divided into two, and there were only two colors, yin and yang. In the middle of these two colors sat a Taoist with his hair combed into a bun, and it was difficult to tell how old he was. His Taoist robe was spread out, and as it slowly rippled, it seemed as if he had merged with heaven and earth. Taoist Zhang Yuan came forward and cupped his hands, saying, "Greetings, fellow Taoist." The Taoist didn't get up and said, "Greetings, fellow Taoist." Taoist Zhang Yuan didn't take it seriously and said, "I have received your instructions, fellow Taoist, and have already gone to investigate." The Taoist said, "How was it?" Taoist Zhang Yuan said, "The fellow Taoist who appeared this time must have a relatively complete creation essence hidden behind him. Moreover, this person's magic power is tyrannical. Even if he hasn't cultivated his cultivation, he can still fight against the three Taoists and win. If he enters my formation, then there will be hope for my great plan." The Taoist said, "In that case, we must find a way to win this fellow Taoist over." Taoist Zhang Yuan said, "I've already told him the pros and cons of the two paths, and now it's up to him to choose. But judging from his expression, he seems to be very concerned about seeking his own Tao. I think it won't be long before he becomes a member of my Tao." At this moment, the Taoist seemed to have sensed something. After a brief calculation, he shook his head and said, not necessarily. Daoist Zhang Yuan was startled and asked with concern, "Fellow Daoist, did you calculate something?" The Daoist said, "I don't know, but I'm afraid there's something wrong here." Daoist Zhang Yuan couldn't help but frown and said, "If that's the case, it seems that I'll have to make a trip." The Daoist nodded and said, "It doesn't matter if this person doesn't become a member of my Dao. But the creation essence fragment is the key. I have a feeling that it's very likely that that person will appear soon. We must seize the opportunity." Daoist Zhang Yuan was startled and said, "Didn't you say that even if that person exists, it's still far from the time to appear?" The Daoist said, "That has always been the case, but the creation essence involves a lot of things. If what that fellow Daoist is hiding behind is what I think it is, then there will be endless variables. That person will eventually appear after receiving this omen." After arranging everything, Zhang Yan calculated and sensed for a long time. After confirming that no one was spying on him, he moved his mind and slowly unfolded the world he came from. Then, his consciousness sank into it. However, at this moment, he had a feeling that if he went to Bushutian, he could directly enter it, and there seemed to be a force waiting for him to seize. But after thinking about it carefully, he didn't do so. There were many mysteries hidden in the creation essence, and before he understood it thoroughly, he would not easily touch it. In a moment, he had landed in the Qinghuan Palace. Because Su Ji had transcended the world and had no interference with it, he was still at the moment when he broke through the realm, as if he had never left. In the heavens, apart from the addition of him, the Grand Supreme, there were no other changes. At this moment, he stretched out his hand to grab, and a bamboo slip was already in his hand. This was the world-aware bamboo slip that led the way that day. But when he looked at it now, it seemed to be incomplete and extremely rotten, and it seemed as if a single breath would scatter it into ashes. He looked at it for a moment, and his eyes deepened. Rumor had it that the sword's consciousness had already transcended, but now it seemed that the rumor was wrong. It was indeed not in this world, but it seemed to have been forcibly taken away by someone. Because what he saw at this moment wasn't a reflection of it, but a mark that was imprinted into the world. In other words, it was still true, but it was damaged and damaged. It wasn't done by itself, but by an external force, which was why it was like this. But who could have done such a thing? The ancestors of the 9 continents should have this ability. Perhaps it was one of them. After all, this treasure was also born in Busu Tian. But he could feel that the purpose of the person who did this was not so simple. Because looking at the broken appearance of the jade slip, it was not to use it, but to destroy it. The purpose of doing this was very worth pondering. The world-knowing bamboo slip was not very useful for the mighty cultivators of the spirit refinement realm, but for the cultivators of the lower realm, it was a natural treasure. Because it did not point out the way, but at least pointed out the path to the spirit refinement realm. If one did not see this thing, almost no one could enter the spirit refinement realm. He turned his wrist, put it away, and called out in his heart. At this time, Jingyu was waiting outside the hall and did not think much. When he heard the call, he immediately returned to the hall. Seeing Zhang Yan sitting on the jade platform, he was startled and said, "Is master?" In his feeling, it was only a moment since he was taken care of by Zhang Yan just now. But his reaction was fast, and he subconsciously asked, "Master is back?" Zhang Yan nodded slightly. Jingyu's body trembled, and he prostrated on the ground. He said loudly, "This little one congratulates master for your success in the way of refinement." Zhang Yan smiled and said, "You have served by my side for many years, and because of this, you have neglected your cultivation. In the future, you will inevitably be trapped in the trap of life and death. Today, I will grant you a good fortune, and allow you to enjoy the virtue of eternal life." As soon as these words were said, it was as if the heaven and earth had bowed down. Jingyu suddenly felt his body become light, as if he was freed from some shackles. He understood in his heart that he was freed from the trap of life and death. He was instantly overjoyed, and he bowed deeply and said with a trembling voice, "This little one thanks master for the reward." Chapter 1950. Zhang Yan waited for Jing Tian to finish kowtowing and said, "Go and call fellow Taoist Wan Ke here." Ever since Taoist Wan Ke made a contract with Zhang Yan and the others, he could entrust his own essence qi to Butian. However, he had the ability of true yang after all, and in order to prevent him from causing trouble outside, his spiritual incarnation was still restrained in the side hall of Qinghuan Palace. He had thought that Zhang Yan had already gone into seclusion to break through the realm, so he could not help but be surprised when he heard him call him, but he did not ask much. When he arrived at the hall, he bowed and said, "Is there anything else, fellow Taoist?" Zhang Yan said, "There is no need to ask anymore." Taoist Wan Ke was stunned, thinking that Zhang Yan had already given up on ascending to the upper realm. At this moment, he was a little disappointed, but at the same time, he heaved a sigh of relief and said, "That's good, that's good." But after saying this, he felt that something was wrong. He looked up at the seat and was slightly dazed. Zhang Yan was clearly sitting there, but he seemed to see the various phenomena of the great Tao that he had seen when ascending to the upper realm that day. He was stunned at first, and then revealed a look of disbelief. Could it be that fellow Taoist has finally taken that step? Zhang Yan smiled and nodded. Taoist Wan Ke was shocked speechless when he got his acknowledgement. He had really tried to break through, and he knew how difficult it was. At that time, he had lost his true self simply because he didn't dare to go there and retreated. Later on, he didn't even dare to delve too deeply into it. To be honest, he didn't think that Zhang Yan would be able to reach the upper realm. Otherwise, he wouldn't have suggested making a backup plan for himself. He bowed to the seat and said in a low voice, "Hall Master, since you have already obtained the Tao, why did you call me here?" Zhang Yan said with a smile, "That day, fellow Taoist, in order to protect yourself, you made a contract with I to send your essence qi to Butian, and I allowed you. But now, I need to use Butian to complete a task, and fellow Taoist is not suitable to stay in it anymore. You need to leave." Taoist Wan Ke pondered for a moment. That day, he insisted on making this agreement because he was afraid that Zhang Yan would drag him down after he transcended to the upper realm. However, since the latter had returned, there was no need to continue this matter. Moreover, although he did not know what abilities the upper realm Almighty had, it would be very easy for them to control him. It was not something that could be bound by a paper contract, so he immediately said, "I will withdraw now." At this point, the contract flew out and disappeared into thin air. However, after doing this, his figure actually became a bit more illusory. It was originally formed from a strand of essence energy, and under normal circumstances, it could at most last for 1,000 years. If it was stored in Busu, then it could still borrow the power of this world to slightly extend its lifespan. Now that it had left, it naturally returned to its original form. When Zhang Yan saw this, he smiled and said, "Since fellow Taoist is willing to withdraw, I will also compensate fellow Taoist." As he spoke, a golden light sprinkled down from the sky and enveloped him. Taoist Wan Ke could not help but reveal a look of disbelief. He opened his hands and looked at it, as if he did not believe it. At this moment, he had actually returned to his original form, and was no longer a broken body formed from essence energy. Even the body of a true yang cultivator was repeated. This supreme Weili deeply shocked him, and he could not help but bow down, and said, "Thank you, Hall Master, for your gift." Zhang Yan nodded slightly and said, "Fellow Taoist, you may dispense with the formalities, this is what you deserve." This time, he gave this opportunity to Taoist Wan Ke, not entirely because he voluntarily withdrew his essence energy, but because he obtained the world-knowing bamboo from him, and later on, when he broke through the realm, he did not have to take many detours. From this point of view, after all, he had done meritorious service, and this time, he was returning the favor. Taoist Wan Ke straightened up, looked up at the seat, and said seriously, "Hall Master, I have a question, I wonder if it is possible." "Zhang Yan, fellow Taoist, please speak." Taoist Wan Ke hesitated for a moment, and said, "May I ask, Hall Master, what is the glory of the upper realm?" Zhang Yan smiled, and replied, "The emptiness sees me, and I see the emptiness." When Taoist Wan Ke heard this, he seemed to have understood something, and bowed heavily to the seat, and said, "Today, I have no regrets listening to the voice of Tao." Zhang Yan, fellow Taoist Wan Ke, so you are also the Yuan Zun of the human Tao. Now that you have recovered your body, you should protect the human Tao, and you can go back to your base, and build a new heaven. Taoist Wan Ke solemnly replied, "As you command." Seeing that Zhang Yan did not speak anymore, he knew that there was nothing else to say, so he bowed to the seat again, and left. Zhang Yan, on the other hand, looked at Bu Su Tian. With this place in his hands, not to mention other things, a primordial cardinal treasure would be born every era, so even if he did not do anything, he would be able to obtain all kinds of benefits out of thin air, but he also needed to be able to protect it. Now that the human Tao had him to suppress it, the internal crisis had been eliminated, but the external crisis had arrived. Now that he had opened the door to Bu Su Tian, it would be like what ancestor Yao Han had said, attracting some of his spirit refinement peers from the void, and he had to face all of these, but if he could comprehend some Tao before these people, he would have more confidence in dealing with them. After sending Taoist Wan Ke off, Jingyu returned to the hall, and asked, "Master, do you want me to invite the enlightened masters over?" Zhang Yan rejected, "There is no rush." He would eventually have an explanation for his return, but now was not the time because he could feel that a heavy pressure was coming. This was a sign that external enemies were coveting him, and it would not be peaceful. The most important thing now was to enter Bu Su Tian, and everything else could be put aside for the time being. Apart from that, he needed to seize the opportunity to make arrangements. The present world created by ancestor Yao Han was likely to unfold again, and after he entered Bu Su Tian to comprehend, he might not have the time to stop it. Therefore, he prepared to create a new river of the present world, and use the karma to confuse it, making it impossible to distinguish which was the cause and which was the consequence. It was like the original clear river being merged with an external river, and it would not be easy to distinguish them. Of course, with the strength of the three enlightened masters, they might be able to do it if they worked hard, but at that time, he would be able to gain something. Just as he was about to do so, he suddenly felt an external power approaching, so he changed his mind and returned to his body. He saw Taoist Zhang Yuan coming from afar. He thought that this person had left very decisively that day, and he should be waiting for him to make a choice. Now that he had come again, he must have encountered something. He said, "What brings you here today, fellow Taoist?" Taoist Zhang Yuan came closer, bowed to him, and said, "Today I have something to report to fellow Taoist, but before that, I have to ask you something first. I wonder if fellow Taoist has chosen a way to walk the Tao." Zhang Yan smiled and said, "If one walks the great Tao, then there must be a way to seek one's self." This was the truth. He did not reject seeking one's self because it was part of the great Tao, but he did not reject seeking external things like Zhang Yuan did. However, there was no need to say this to Zhang Yuan. Taoist Zhang Yuan heard this and said with relief, "Fellow Taoist is indeed one of us." Zhang Yan just smiled faintly. Taoist Zhang Yuan's expression became serious and he said, "If that's the case, I'll be frank with fellow Taoist. Just now, when you opened the portal behind you, did you feel that danger was approaching?" Zhang Yan nodded and said, "Yes, there was indeed such an omen." Taoist Zhang Yuan sighed and said, "Fellow Taoist, do you remember that in seeking one's self, there was once a person who wanted to destroy all external things?" Zhang Yan raised his eyebrows and said, "Is this omen related to this person?" Taoist Zhang Yuan sighed and said, "Yes, this person firmly believes that only by destroying all external things can he achieve the great Tao. In the past, whenever a relatively complete fragment of the essence of creation appeared, he would come forward to snatch it. Not to mention his profound cultivation, all the fragments he found were refined into magic treasures in his hands. Therefore, he is far from being able to resist him alone. Fellow Taoist, you must have been spied by him, so I'm afraid that you won't have a peaceful day." Zhang Yan could understand this person's purpose in doing so. Those who sought external things relied on comprehending the essence of creation to improve their cultivation. Naturally, this person would not allow such a large fragment of the essence of creation to fall into the hands of those seeking external things. Seeing that Meng Qi was lost in thought, Taoist Zhang Yuan said, "In addition to warning you, I also came to ask if fellow Taoist needs any help." Zhang Yan changed his mind and realized that Taoist Zhang Yuan taking the initiative to help him was different from him asking for help. The former was voluntary, while the latter owed him a favor. He smiled and cupped his hands, saying, "Thank you for warning me, fellow Taoist. If I need help, I won't be polite." Taoist Zhang Yuan nodded and said, "So, if fellow Taoist needs my help, you only need to call me." Then, he solemnly reminded Meng Qi, "If that great enemy comes, fellow Taoist will find it difficult to resist. I'd rather give up the present world than let this person obtain it." Zhang Yan smiled and said, "I understand." Taoist Zhang Yuan reminded Meng Qi to be careful again, cupped his hands, and left just as he had come. Zhang Yan's eyes flashed as he watched Taoist Zhang Yuan leave. He could feel that there were many untruths in Taoist Zhang Yuan's words, or that there were only some truths mixed in. The matter behind this was definitely not as simple as it seemed. When there were not too many secrets between the mighty cultivators of the spirit refinement realm, he only needed to make his own arrangements. Some things would eventually become clear in the future. After pondering for a while, he sank into Busu Tian. On the other side, Ancestor Yao Han suddenly sensed something and said, "Just now, that Taoist Zhang's magic power is strange. He has most likely entered Busu Tian. We can't wait any longer. The longer he meditates, the longer his cultivation will be, and the smaller our chances will be. Moreover, there are still people coveting it outside. We must snatch it before they do." Taoist Yu Qiu was a little hesitant. Just now, he also sensed that a tyrannical Wei was coming, and the source was Busu Tian. He said, "That Taoist Zhang is not easy to deal with, and we may not be able to defeat him. Why don't we wait for him to go first, and when the battle becomes intense, we can snatch it?" At this time, Taoist Yu Lu said in a deep voice, "Just now, I have deduced that there is a great danger in that Wei. If I don't act now, I won't have another chance." As fellow Taoist Yao Han said, "It's better to act first. Even if I can't snatch Busu Tian, I can still disturb that Taoist Zhang's enlightenment." Chapter 1951. Zhang Yan let his consciousness act in the present world while his real body spread out his magic power in the silence of the void. In an instant, he evolved a place that was similar to the present world, and it was even closer to the one created by the Yao Han ancestor. The changes in that world stopped after the sword fight between the 16 sections. Therefore, he had to create the same changes in the past and not make any changes in the future. This way, when the other party made the same plan again, there would be a chance to mix it up. After concentrating on arranging all these, he spread out his magic power and placed this world with the thousands of other worlds. This way, it would be difficult to distinguish the real from the fake. He looked into the depths of the silence and could feel that the Yao Han ancestor and the other two were ready to make a move. It seemed that they would attack soon, but it was also possible that they would wait for the person mentioned by Taoist Zhang Yuan to make a move and then take advantage of the situation. He did not care about what this person would choose. He only cared about being prepared. After his wisp of consciousness sank into Busu Tian, he only felt illusory scenes floating in front of him. He knew that they were related to the past and future of this world, but most of them were blurry. He calmed his mind and turned a blind eye to them. Spirit refinement cultivators existed in the silence and had no beginning or end. However, once their consciousness sank into the present world, there would naturally be a distinction between the past and the future. Although spirit refinement cultivators could go to any time in the river of the present world, such a move was meaningless to them. Because no matter how the present world changed, everything would naturally disappear when the river flowed away. If they felt that something was not right and wanted to change it, they could choose a place that needed to be bent and open up another river of the present world. In the future, the river would naturally flow according to their wishes. However, this would not work in the present world because this place was connected to Busu Tian. Regardless of whether he jumped into the future or into the past, it was difficult to guarantee that he would not lose Busu Tian. Moreover, it was very likely that there were some tricks set up by a powerful person here. If he tried to peep into it, it was very likely that he would fall into it. Therefore, he did not pay attention to it and only let his consciousness sink into the depths. Not long after, he felt that his body was empty as if everything was empty. At the same time, countless truths of the great Tao were reflected into his body. At this time, he suddenly had a feeling that as long as he continued like this, he would eventually be able to see the true door of the great Tao and achieve the supreme wonderful state. At this time, he suddenly had a feeling that as long as he continued like this, he would eventually be able to see the true door of the great Tao and achieve the supreme wonderful state. After meditating for a while, he opened his eyes and thought to himself, there is a great fortune here, but there is also a great danger. Although this bushroot heaven contained the mysteries of the great Tao, in reality, the amount of cultivation you had depended on how much you could bear. Because the profundities contained within the two fragments he obtained earlier weren't abundant, he was able to easily deal with all the grand Tao techniques that were reflected into his body, and it was like drinking tea and water that moistened his heart. But when he comprehended the Tao earlier, it was like he'd thrown himself into an ocean, and if he was greedy, he would only drown himself. He thought for a while. Before he completely comprehended the mysteries of the great Tao just now, it was not suitable for him to sink into the comprehension. If he was covered by the great Tao, even if he was a powerful person in the spirit refinement realm, it was very likely that he would lose himself. At that time, he might become one with Bu Su Tian and become a part of it. Then, he would no longer exist in the outside world. However, after what happened just now, he found that his cultivation had improved again. This was also expected, but at this time, an accident occurred. As his cultivation increased slightly, the jade plate that he could faintly sense became abnormally clear at this moment. His eyes flashed, but he did not miss this opportunity. He immediately chased after it with his spiritual power and used his spiritual power to guide it. After a while, there was a jade plate in his hand. This was not a reflection, but the real thing. But when he took a look, he raised his eyebrows. It was missing a corner. If it was not a natural defect, then its original effect would be greatly reduced. But no matter what, this thing was very likely to be related to the Tai Ming patriarch. The reflection that it landed on might very well contain clues of the patriarch. Thus, he turned his spiritual will and followed this thing to observe the countless current worlds. After searching for a long time, his gaze finally landed on a current world. This was most likely the place where Taoist Quan Lai's ancestor lived. It could be seen that this place had been contaminated by external forces, which was why it had not collapsed yet. However, it was not far from the end. In other words, it would not be long before the heavens within the current world would perish along with the disappearance of the long river of the current world. He immediately sent a strand of his consciousness in and saw that he had landed on a piece of broken land. It was hazy, and half of the sky was dark, while the other half was shimmering. There were red and white spots intertwined, and there were even some that were pitch black, as if it was swallowing everything there. This was a sign that the spiritual vigor was exhausted, the stars were falling, and it was a sign of life and death. He originally wanted to try to look over, but because of the obstruction of that mighty force, he could only see a blur. At this moment, that force had already merged with this world, and if he tried to force it, it was very likely that it would cause it to collapse prematurely. In the blink of an eye, he looked around the universe that hadn't been broken yet. However, he didn't find anything useful, so he retreated from inside. After that, he examined the other current worlds that the jade plate had illuminated, and most of them were worthless. At this moment, he was almost certain that the place where the disciple related to the Tai Ming patriarch was probably in the place that the missing corner pointed to, so he could not find him for the time being. Fortunately, he was not obsessed with this. It would be good if he could find him, but it did not matter if he could not. At least he had obtained the jade plate, which should also be a treasure. When he understood the secret behind it, it might be of great use. After Taoist Zhang Yuan bid farewell to Zhang Yan, he once again returned to the stagnant current world. When the Taoist sitting in the yin and yang qi saw him return, he said, "Taoist friend, how about going to explore it?" Taoist Zhang Yuan replied, "Taoist friend Zhang is very cautious. Although he opened that door, I stayed there for a while, but not a single trace was revealed. It seems that he has taken precautions. The Taoist sighed and said, even if he did everything properly, he might not be able to resist all the external enemies. He looked to the side and said, if I'm not wrong, Yu Lu and the others have already become impatient, and it is very likely that they will use their magic power to fight again. Taoist Zhang Yuan's expression became solemn, and he said, then should we go and help? The Taoist thought for a moment and said, there is no hurry. Taoist friend Zhang can still deal with him at the moment. It will not be too late for us to help when he can't hold on anymore. Taoist Zhang Yuan thought for a moment and said, but in that case, Taoist Zhang may not be willing to open his heart to me. Lending a hand at a critical moment was naturally good, and he would be able to win a favor from Zhang Yan. However, such actions were truly too utilitarian. He felt that even if he helped Zhang Yan might try to return the favor because of the favor he owed him, but Zhang Yan would absolutely not take him to be someone close to him. This was extremely disadvantageous to their subsequent plans. After all, he didn't just want to obtain the location of the creation essence, he really wanted to rope Zhang Yan in at the same time. The Taoist shook his head and said, this arrangement is not to ask for a favor, but to guard against the person who is coming. Taoist Zhang Yuan frowned and said, yes, this person is not easy to deal with, but it is difficult to know when he will come. The Taoist said, let's just wait. In fact, if this Taoist friend Zhang can really solve this matter with his own strength, it will be a good thing, and we will not have to show up so early. After the three patriarchs finished their discussion, they no longer hesitated and prepared to seize Bushutian again. They had invested a lot of effort in this matter, and they had even used up many fragments of the creation essence. It seemed that the fragments they had lent to the two patriarchs had not been returned yet, and it was unlikely that they would be able to get them back. Therefore, this matter had to be completed, and it had to be done before others succeeded. Otherwise, they would become the harbingers of others. Because of their previous failure, they were even more careful this time. Patriarch Yao Han observed for a moment and saw that as Zhang Yan's magic power expanded, thousands of realms appeared. He knew that Bushutian's door was in one of these realms, but even with his eyesight, he could not tell which one was his target just now. He could only vaguely see that Zhang Yan was fully prepared. He said, fellow Taoists, that person has already made arrangements and is waiting for me to come. If I go now, I will fall into his trap. Taoist Yu Qiu said, do you have a countermeasure? Patriarch Yao Han said, there is no harm in creating another realm. If we can lure him to attack, we can wait for him to exhaust himself. If he does not move, then we can use karma to deduce Bushutian's location. Taoist Yu Qiu thought for a moment and said, that is appropriate. He immediately opened his palm and summoned the sapling again. In an instant, the world appeared again. It was just that the previous incarnation was forced to end. If they wanted to continue, they would need to plunder more karma. Ancestor Yao Han and the other two had planned to use their magic power to collide a few times and then make some calculations. It would not be difficult to obtain this. However, things didn't go very smoothly this time. Even after working hard for a long time, they didn't gain anything. This was undoubtedly because Zhang Yan had resolved all of their calculations. The expressions of the three of them darkened. They did not expect that Zhang Yan could only use his mana to suppress them last time. Not too long had passed and he already had this kind of ability. This meant that his cultivation had improved greatly. Taoist Yu Qiu said, since this method cannot be used, we can only take the initiative. Patriarch Yao Han took out a spell and said, I will try to find the door. Taoist Yu Qiu said, there is no need. From what I can see, he is using a magic treasure to conceal himself. There is no need to waste time with him. Why don't we use the treasure I refined to break the barrier and reveal the truth? Patriarch Yao Han and Taoist Yu Qiu thought for a moment and agreed, let's do as you say. Taoist Yu Qiu waved his sleeve. In an instant, a clear light flowed and a magic treasure that looked like a jade all flew out and headed for the myriad realms. Chapter 1952. Before ancestor Yao Han and the other two arrived, Zhang Yan had already sensed it from the fluctuations of magic power. In a battle between spirit refinement cultivators, either the difference in cultivation was too great, or one side was caught off guard and made a mistake. Otherwise, there was no such thing as being ambushed, and it was a battle of magic power. Even if the enemy killed Wan Zhen, it was impossible for it to be so quiet. Just like before Daoist Zhang Yuan warned him, he could already feel the huge pressure. At this moment, he saw a magic treasure descending from the opposite side. He immediately activated his mana and tried to block it. However, this thing was very sharp. The treasure light that he had set up to cover the outside was torn apart like thin paper. The magic treasure directly broke in. He could not help but stare at it. He had never seen this treasure before, so it must have been refined after the last defeat. Otherwise, it would have been taken out long ago and not hidden until now. There was no doubt that it was used to deal with him. As such, he now had to face pressure from two different directions. On one hand, he was being pressured by Yao Han and the other two. On the other hand, he was being pressured by the treasures. If he were to face them all at once, it would obviously be inappropriate. He could only defeat them one by one. He made up his mind and did not hesitate. He made a few deductions from the broken jade and calculated the changes in his magic power. Then, his intent was reflected outside and suddenly erupted. In an instant, the magic power surged like a raging wave. Ancestor Yao Han and the other two had learned their lesson last time and were prepared. They knew that Zhang Yan's magic power would be launched without warning, so they were not caught off guard this time. But at the same time, Zhang Yan's magic power was more profound than last time, so the level of magic power was higher. Even though they were prepared, they could only barely hold their ground under the tyrannical pressure. Not only did the magic power they had sent out not advance, it even seemed to be retreating. Zhang Yan suppressed the three of them, so he had time to focus on dealing with the magic treasure that was flying towards him. With a thought, the tiny golden bead flew up and turned into a ray of golden light that flew towards the magic treasure. Boom! The two magic treasures collided head-on, but the jade all only paused for a moment, its momentum did not change at all. Zhang Yan saw that the tiny golden bead's attack had failed, so he continued to urge it to collide with it again. In just a moment, both sides had collided several dozen times, but the jade all seemed to be unshakable. Even though its momentum was slightly hindered, it was still unswervingly charging in. He stared at it and knew that this attack could not be avoided. He had to think of a way to block it. Otherwise, if it penetrated into the real world behind it, it was very likely that the other three would discover the real world where Bu Su Tian was. So he repeatedly activated the Tai golden bead. Although he kept the magic treasure still, it was like it was stuck in a quagmire, and it was difficult to move. Patriarch Yao Han and the other two also felt their magic treasures being obstructed. This time, they had come for a quick victory because they were afraid that others would take advantage of them if the battle dragged on. Therefore, they didn't have any more tricks up their sleeves. They hurriedly took out their defensive magic treasures to block a portion of Zhang Yan's invading magic power. Then, they used the rest of their power on their magic treasures, pushing them deeper into the depths. The three of them had chosen to defend, and now that they had this, their fighting ability had increased by more than a little. Although they had to pay a heavy price, if they could win over Bu Su Tian, then there was nothing to regret. Zhang Yan saw that the Tai golden bead could no longer block the jade all. His eyes flashed, and the crystal jade water droplets that had been covering the real world suddenly appeared out of thin air, blocking the way. But this only slightly hindered the jade all's momentum, and it still passed through. In the blink of an eye, it was in front of him. If the treasure was hit, although it would not do much to him, it would definitely disrupt his magic power, and he would lose his advantage. His eyes flashed, and he did not dodge. Instead, he stretched out a finger and touched the magic treasure. In an instant, the opposing magic power was pushed back, and the next moment, the jade all was knocked off course. The moment the treasure shot out, it broke through several layers of obstacles and penetrated deep into the core area. It could not be said to be weak, but this place was also the closest to him, and it was also the place where the magic power was the strongest. Without a doubt, it collided head-on with the strongest point. The Jade Owl's attack failed and suddenly disappeared, but it was called back by Patriarch Yahan and the other two. They knew that they had no chance to attack again, but this magic treasure could be used repeatedly. If the first time failed, they could find another chance to throw it. Just now, attacking with all their might was not completely fruitless. It was because of the Jade Owl that they were able to break into the depths of Zhang Yan's ripples and peek into the real world behind him. Patriarch Yahan calculated and said, "Although I found a few places, I can't be sure. I need to observe more." He originally thought that even if the current world that led to Bushu Heaven was hidden, the river of the current world was definitely still evolving and had not finished. As long as he found such a place, he would be able to identify the true location of the door based on the connection of cause and effect. Just now Patriarch Yahan found a few suspicious places, but this was clearly impossible. It could only be that Zhang Yan had set it up in advance. Because of this, he suspected that what he saw was not the real target. Taoist Jade Leek said, "No problem, let's try again." He waved his sleeve and threw the Jade all into the river again. After Zhang Yan had fought this magic treasure once, he already had a rough understanding of its ability, so he dealt with it very calmly this time. Just like last time, he first used the Tai Golden Pearl to weaken its force, and after the treasure went deep into his body, he used his magic power to expel it. But then, the three of them repeatedly used the treasure. He knew that this person was doing this to find out where Bu Su Tian was. But at the same time, as he came into contact with this magic treasure more and more, he could gradually figure out its structure. If he kept using it to attack it, it would not be difficult to suppress it after he finished his calculations. It all depended on who could reach their goal first. While he was calculating, he felt a slight disturbance in his magic power. Someone else was approaching him. But he did not move and continued to deal with the situation before him. Since he could sense it, then Patriarch Yahan and the others should be able to sense it as well. If this person was with him, or if he had help, then there was no need for the three of them to arrive first. They could just deal with him together. If not, then this person's goal would be in conflict with Patriarch Yahan and the others. So if this person appeared now, they would be even more anxious than him. After probing for a dozen times and making various deductions, Yu Lu and the other two finally determined a place. They felt that it was very likely to be the door that led to Bu Su Tian. Even though it was difficult to enter under the obstruction of Zhang Yan's power, they could still use it to obtain more karma. Forefather Yao Han felt that something wasn't quite right. Although he could not see anything wrong, he felt that things had gone too smoothly this time. Perhaps they should be more cautious. Just as he was about to speak, Taoist Yu Lu suddenly said, "Fellow Taoists, someone else has arrived." Taoist Yu Qiu said, "Fellow Taoist Yao Han, we cannot wait any longer. Please act quickly." Patriarch Yahan also sensed that there was a powerful wali approaching. This person was not simple. He knew that he could not delay any longer. He pointed at the sapling and sent his karma into it. But then his expression changed. "Not good. The karma here is chaotic. We've fallen into Taoist Zhang's trap." He had wanted to use a spell to expel the karma that had mixed in, but it was like two muddy and clear waters mixing together. The more it stirred, the more muddy it became. Knowing that he could not continue, he immediately stopped. Taoist Yu Lu also saw the problem. He calmly said, "It's fine. I have this magic treasure in hand. As long as I seize the karma, it will only be a matter of starting anew." With a thought, the Jade all shot forward again. But at this moment, suddenly, a funnel of white chi appeared out of thin air, blocking the path of the treasure. With just a turn, the Jade all disappeared into thin air. Patriarch Yahan and the other two's expressions changed. They were able to seize the initiative this time because of this magic treasure. They did not expect it to be taken away by someone else. They turned their heads and saw that in the silence, a Taoist in green stood there quietly. No one knew when he had appeared. He looked at the three of them as if he was thinking about something, but he seemed uncertain at the same time. Taoist Yu Qiu stood up and bowed. May I know who you are? Why are you making things difficult for us? The azure-robed Taoist ignored him. He looked at Patriarch Yao Han and said, I recognize you, but I don't recognize these two. He pointed at Taoist Yu Qiu and Taoist Yu Qiu. Patriarch Yao Han frowned. I don't seem to have any dealings with you. The azure-robed Taoist's expression was calm. He said, I don't care what you're planning. Just retreat. I won't make things difficult for you. Patriarch Yao Han solemnly said, Do you think we have a chance of winning if we work together? Taoist Yu Qiu said, This person's magic treasure is powerful, and his cultivation is a level higher than mine. If we fight now, it will be difficult to win. There are still people watching from the outside, and they are enemies, not friends. That's why they don't want to clash with me. Why don't we retreat for now and see what he does? It won't be too late to come up with a plan. Taoist Yu Qiu also said, Taoist Yu Qiu is right. We are only here for Taoist Zhang's backer, Bu Shutian. Since we are in a difficult position, it's fine to take a step back. After some discussion, the three of them did not insist. They cupped their fists and retreated to the side. Seeing that the three of them were unwilling to leave, the green-robed Taoist didn't mind. He turned around and looked at where Zhang Yan was. He cupped his hands and said, Greetings, fellow Taoist. Today, I have returned to discuss a matter with you. Can you allow me to speak? Zhang Yan's heart stirred. He waved his sleeves and dispersed his magic power. He returned the bow and said, Taoist, please come closer. Chapter 1953. When Taoist Zhang Yuan saw the azure-robed Taoist, his expression turned serious and he said, Fellow Taoist, that person is here. Then he saw the azure-robed Taoist put away the magic treasures of Yao Han ancestor and the others. He frowned and said, I wonder what he wants to do. The Taoist sitting there said, Let's see what he does. While they were talking, the azure-robed Taoist rebuked Yao Han ancestor and the others. Then, he was invited by Zhang Yan. Taoist Zhang Yuan frowned. He didn't expect the azure-robed Taoist to do this. After thinking for a moment, he turned his head and said, Fellow Taoist, I thought we should stop them from talking. The Taoist pondered for a moment and said, No. That Taoist Zhang doesn't trust me. If we stop him rashly, he will be even more suspicious. From what I heard from you, fellow Taoist Zhang is a very determined person. He won't be easily swayed by words, so let him speak. Taoist Zhang Yuan said worriedly, But if we sit here and do nothing, we will lose the initiative. The Taoist remained calm and said, Don't worry. Let's wait a little longer. Zhang Yan watched the azure-robed Taoist walk through the void and gradually approach them. He asked, How should I address you, fellow Taoist? The azure-robed Taoist said, I used to be called Saint Sung Qingsheng. Now that I've cut off one of my names, everyone calls me Saint Sung. Zhang Yan raised his eyebrows and said, So it's fellow Taoist Saint Sung. In the spirit refinement realm, it was common for magic power to fuse and collide. The closer one was, the more intense the battle would be. However, like Taoist Zhang Yuan, this person's magic power fluctuated very little. Either his cultivation had reached a certain level, or he had hidden magic treasures. Judging from his aura, it was this person who had given him such heavy pressure earlier, so he thought it was more likely that it was the former. Although Taoist Zhang Yuan had described this person as dangerous, he didn't really believe it. It wasn't because this person was polite up until now, but because he never judged his opponents based on their superficial behavior. If this person was really that crazy, then the other spirit refinement cultivators would definitely join forces to eliminate him. How would he dare to appear here so brazenly? Just as he was thinking, Taoist Qingsheng said, Zhang Yuan should have come to find you, right? Zhang Yan had nothing to hide and said, That's right. Qingsheng said calmly, That person must have said that I am a self-centered person who sees everything as a burden and wants to kill everything. Zhang Yan smiled and didn't answer. Qing Sheng said bluntly, actually, Zhang Yuan is right. I do have such thoughts, but I also know that there are things that can be done and things that cannot be done. It is too stupid to fight against so many people alone. Zhang Yan agreed. He could sense that besides himself, this person viewed everyone else as foreign objects that could be destroyed. The reason why he hadn't done so was because he didn't have the ability to do so at the moment, so he could only endure it for now. What Qing Sheng said was to tell him that even though he had such thoughts, at least he didn't plan to be his enemy. Qing Sheng said, I have something to discuss with you. Zhang Yan wanted to hear what Qing Sheng wanted to say, so he made an inviting gesture and said, please speak, Taoist. Qing Sheng looked at the thousands of worlds around him and said, if I'm not wrong, there is a place behind you that contains the essence of creation? Zhang Yan nodded and said, there is indeed such a place. This matter couldn't be hidden. Since the three of them had found their way to the door, anyone with a discerning eye would know what was going on. Moreover, if he didn't sense anything, Taoist Qing Sheng wouldn't have come looking for him. Qing Sheng said, this is a natural land of creation and there are many uses for it. I've seen you use the fragments of the essence of creation to craft a treasure. I'm sure you understand that if there's enough of it, it can be used as a shelter for someone. Zhang Yan's heart skipped a beat. When his consciousness entered Busu Tian, he had a feeling that he could directly enter this place. To him, Busu Tian was like a vast ocean that couldn't be fathomed. It wasn't something that could be shaken by external forces. If he set it up properly and had some tricks up his sleeves, he could indeed use this place as a shelter. Qing Sheng's words made him think of another possibility. If he could make good use of this place, it could be of great help to him. He thought about it and asked, could it be that you want to use this place to shelter someone? Qing Sheng admitted, I will be in trouble in the future. Only by finding the essence of creation behind you can I avoid it. I don't want anything from you, I just want you to let me hide when the time comes. Zhang Yan smiled faintly and didn't say a word. Seeing that Zhang Yan didn't reply, Qing Sheng said, of course. There is no proof, and I am not bound by promises. I will not let you work for nothing. If you agree, I can take all the remnants of the essence of creation and give them all to you to repay the favor. Zhang Yan smiled and said, if I were to walk the path of self-seeking, wouldn't these be useless? Qing Sheng said, the path of self-seeking does not require external help, but it doesn't mean that I don't need external help. If I don't have any treasures, how can I compete with others? How can I take the treasures of Yao Han and the others? Moreover, the emptiness is also an external help. How can I get rid of it? Before I reach the last step, I still need external help. Even if there is a difference, it is just a difference in emphasis. Zhang Yan looked at him and said, if I need it, I will take it myself. I will not ask others to take it. Qing Sheng was surprised that Shen Lian rejected him. He looked at Shen Lian and his eyes became sharper. He said, are you not afraid that I will take it by force? Zhang Yan looked calm. If Qing Sheng could take it by force, there was no need for him to say unnecessary words. Since he was able to find Bushutian, he could also hide it. Although doing so might cause him to be unable to find this place in the future, if he really couldn't protect it, then he could still make a decision. He looked up and said, I was also thinking that since the essence of creation can be used to shelter people of the same generation, then it can also be used to imprison people. If I can keep you here today, then I can end this matter. There is no need to wait for the future. Ever since Qing Sheng appeared, he had been calm as if everything was in his control. However, when he heard what Shen Lian said, his expression changed. Although he was confident that his cultivation was better than Zhang Yan's, in terms of mana, he might not necessarily be able to suppress the latter. One must know that he was standing at the place where Zhang Yan's mana was the most concentrated, so he had a greater advantage. If that was all, he could still deal with it. However, there were still people watching him from the outside. He was sure that if he fought with Zhang Yan, this person might come to make things difficult for him. Then, it would not be an empty promise to suppress him in the essence of creation. Although Daoist Jade Leek and the other two were still outside, because he had taken their treasures, they would definitely be happy to see this. After realizing this, he said, since fellow Daoist feels that it is inappropriate, then there is no need to rush this matter. I will naturally deliver the good fortune fragment to you, and fellow Daoist will understand my sincerity. I will take my leave first. Zhang Yan smiled and said, since you are here, why are you in such a hurry to leave? Also, I have one more thing to ask. Just now, he did have the intention to make the other party stay and find a way to trap him in Bushutian. However, after thinking about it again, even if he could do it, his future would not be stable. As Ancestor Yao Han said, as long as Bushutian was here, there would be more people looking for him. With this person outside, if he really went around to steal the essence of creation, then he would be able to gain more time to improve his cultivation. Thus, he gave up on this idea. As for why he spoke now, it was because he had a question in his mind. Qing Xing stopped and said, you are too polite. If I know, I will definitely tell you. Zhang Yan said, just now, when you arrived, you said you knew Ancestor Yao Han, but he did not seem to know you. Why is that? Qing Xing nodded and said, I see. The way to seek oneself is to break through the stubbornness of truth. After breaking through the truth, there will be gains and losses. I think that others can see that I am willing to give up and I am willing to accept it. Zhang Yan thought about it and understood what he meant. According to Qing Sheng, after breaking through the stubbornness of truth, he gave up a part of Ancestor Yao Han's memory of himself. Because his cultivation was higher than Ancestor Yao Han's, Ancestor Yao Han did not recognize him. This was not because Qing Sheng was deliberately targeting someone, but because of his way of seeking oneself. He viewed everyone as his enemy, so he did his best to make everyone in the same generation ignore him. As for those with similar or equivalent cultivation, they should not be affected by this. If this person's existence could be hidden from everyone, then Taoist Zhan Yuan would not have come to warn them. He nodded and said, thank you for clearing my doubts. Qing Sheng looked at him and said, however, there is something mysterious about Ancestor Yao Han. You need to be careful when you come down. You need to know that we are not the only ones who want to obtain the essence of creation. Zhang Yan's eyes flickered and he said, oh. Can you tell me more about it? Qing Sheng pondered for a while and said, when the creation essence broke apart, other than the fragments that were scattered in the world, many of them had turned into treasures. Now, they are floating in the void. However, many of them were born with great fortune and merged with our divine qi, allowing them to take human form. Although they do not have the ability to open up the world, they have a strong foundation and are no weaker than us. They are the real treasures of creation. If we can subdue one of them, we will be invincible even if we can't defeat our enemies. Qing Sheng pondered for a while and said, when the creation essence broke apart, other than the fragments that were scattered in countless worlds, many of them had turned into treasures on their own. However, there are also some who have always been enemies with me because they can only rely on good fortune fragments to improve their cultivations. So, every time something like this appears and is noticed by them, they will definitely come to seize it. Speaking to here, he said, I have had dealings with this person before, relying on my cultivation, I have never been taken advantage of. But just now, I saw that Taoist Yao Han's body, there was a similar presence of qi. Therefore, if this person is not involved with him, then he must have had dealings with him before. Friend, you must be careful. Chapter 1954. Zhang Yan did not expect Patriarch Yao Han to have such a background. Whether the Patriarch Yao Han attacked him out of his own will or was it related to the treasure spirit of creation that Azure Saint mentioned, it was hard to tell. It seemed like there was no difference, but under the circumstances where the Patriarch Yao Han could not get what he wanted, there was a possibility that the Patriarch Yao Han was drawn out. He nodded and said, thank you for your reminder. Azure Saint said, you don't have to thank me. Before I get what I want, I don't want the treasure spirit of creation to be taken away by others. Zhang Yan smiled and said, there are many who want it, but no one, including you, has been able to get what they want. Azure Saint stared at him for a moment and said, that's good. I only hope that you can guard it well. Once I'm done, I will come and find you. He paused for a while and waved his sleeve, and a green jade talisman flew out. This is my token. If you encounter any difficulties in the future, or if you change your mind, you can use this. I will sense it and come to you. As he spoke, he cupped his fists and left. This time, Zhang Yan did not stop him. He split the waves of mana and let them go. Azure Saint came out of Zhang Yan's whirlpool and was about to leave when Taoist Yu Qiu came up and bowed. Friend, please wait. Azure Saint stopped and asked, what's the matter? Taoist Yu Qiu said, just now, you took away our treasure to stop us from fighting. Now that the matter is over, can you return it to us? Azure Saint glanced at him and said, I live in Sangqing world. If you want the treasure back, you can come here. I will be waiting for you. Taoist Yu Qiu was not annoyed and smiled, all right. Since you invited me, I will come and disturb you. Azure Saint ignored him and flicked his sleeve. His body turned into a ray of light and he flew into the depths of the void. He'd told Zhang Yanyan that he would collect the fragments of essence of creation, and this was indeed his true thoughts. For the sake of avoiding that future danger, he had no choice but to do this. Even though Taoist Yu Qiu had quite a few fragments, he didn't intend to make a move against Taoist Yu Qiu because he was extremely fearful of those treasure spirits of creation, and he guessed that they might be setting up something. Under the current circumstances, they didn't want to come into conflict with them, so they let them go for now. Taoist Yu Qiu watched as Qin Mu's silhouette flew further and further away from the crowd. His mana rippled until he could no longer sense Qin Mu's presence. He then turned back and repeated what he had told Qing Sheng. He then sighed and said, this person is the one who stabilized the world. It seems like we won't be able to retrieve the treasure. Any cultivator who had achieved the world-stopping realm would have reached a certain level of attainment. He deduced that Qing Sheng had most likely passed the understanding truth barrier and this was not something that they could deal with. Taoist Yu Qiu said, but without the treasure, we won't be able to win against Taoist Zhang. Ancestor Yao Han frowned. Losing the treasure was serious, but it was not the most important thing. If they failed this time, they could think of other ways. But from Azure Saint's attitude, there must be some collusion between the two. If Zhang Yan was helped, it would be difficult for them to have another chance. Taoist Yu Qiu said, it seems like there is no chance this time. Why don't we retreat first? Taoist Yu Qiu nodded and asked, what does Taoist Yao Han think? Ancestor Yao Han sighed, that's the only way. It was not that they were careless this time, but it was hard to guard against such a sudden change. This was not the first time they encountered such a situation. Fortunately, cultivating the spirit meant eternal life. Usually, a momentary defeat did not mean anything. Instead, the price they had to pay was too high and the rewards were too little. The three left after coming to an agreement. Before leaving, Ancestor Yao Han turned back and looked at the thousands of realms behind him. He suddenly had a premonition that if he retreated now, he would not have another chance to take Busu Tian. Zhang Yan watched as the three of them retreated. He knew that this matter was over. Their treasures had been taken away, and before they found a way to deal with him, they would not come back. Also, he could sense that there were no other dangers. He could live in peace for a while. However, after listening to Qing Sheng's words, he understood that even after attaining the spirit refinement realm and gaining boundless power, he would still face a lot of dangers. But he felt that this was not a bad thing. Looking at these dangers, they were all because of the competition between people of the same generation. He once told Zhang Yuan that as a cultivator, one should not be afraid of danger, only afraid that there would be no path to the Grand Tao. Just like how the spirit refinement cultivators fought against each other, the competition between cultivators was also a part of seeking the Tao. It was unavoidable. People like Azure Saint who only pursued their own Tao could not avoid this. If they did not fight, then they could only sit and wait for others to find them. Only by being above many people of the same generation could one ensure their own safety. Only by having a higher cultivation could one achieve this. These two aspects pushed each other. Under this pressure, everyone either passively or actively walked toward the Grand Tao. But this also gave rise to a problem that he had been thinking about ever since he became a spirit refinement cultivator. It could be said that there were countless realms reflected in the void, so from this, there should be countless spirit refinement cultivators as well. But this was not the case at all. Based on his own experience, it was impossible for such a figure to exist in the main world that wasn't tainted by the essence of creation. Moreover, the fragment of creation essence had not reached a certain level, so it could not contain the spirit refinement whaley. It was like how an arowana could not float in a shallow pond. Even if one could grow, they could only be trapped in it and could not leave. Only existences like Busu Tian could transcend the world. There should be very few of such existences. Just looking at what Ancestor Yao Han and the others had done was enough to prove it. Another reason was that he also tried to observe the world and search for the fragment of the essence of creation, but he didn't find anything. Hence, he deduced that it might even take the initiative to avoid the almighty cultivators of the spirit refinement realm. He didn't want to find it just because he wanted to. Other than that, he deduced that some of the fragments might have been affected by the great force when it collapsed, which was why they hadn't appeared yet. On the other hand, many people of the same generation had been looking for the location of the creation essence. Whenever they saw it, they would definitely take it. This further reduced the possibility of the spirit refinement cultivators appearing. While he was thinking, a clear light came from the distance. At the same time, there were waves of mana. It was obvious that another person of the same generation had arrived. He looked up and smiled. I knew that you would be here. Taoist Sun Yuan came up and bowed. Sorry to disturb you, but Azure Saint and I have always been enemies, so I wanted to ask why you are here. Zhang Yan said, this person is a little different from what you have described. Taoist Sun Yuan asked in a deep voice, then do you think that what I said the day before was biased? Zhang Yan smiled and said, that is not the case. I know that this person has the intention to destroy all external things, but he does not have the strength to do so at the moment. If he sees that I am easy to bully, he will most likely attack me immediately. It is just that he has some scruples this time, so he did not immediately fall out with me. Taoist Sun Yuan looked at him and said, have you made a promise with this person? Zhang Yan shook his head and said with a smile, I have never promised anything. However, the world changes. Today's friends may become tomorrow's enemies, and today's enemies may become tomorrow's friends. Hearing this, Taoist Sun Yuan thought for a while and sighed. The great Tao is difficult to pursue. One person walking alone is not as good as many people walking together. Zhang Yan said, that is true. I think that there is no need to distinguish between friend and foe so clearly, unless there is a cause and effect that cannot be solved. At this moment, Taoist Sun Yuan understood Zhang Yan's true attitude. He would not deliberately favor anyone, and he treated everyone who had not become enemies with him the same way. Taoist Sun Yuan thought that this was not necessarily a bad thing. Although he could not make Zhang Yan stand on his side for the time being, he did not have to worry about him being roped in by others. Thus, he nodded and said, thank you for your frankness. I will not disturb your cultivation any longer. I will take my leave now. At this time, Zhang Yan said, wait, Taoist Sun Yuan. Taoist Sun Yuan said, is there anything else, Taoist Sun Yuan? Zhang Yan said, does Taoist Sun Yuan know about the treasure spirit of creation? Taoist Sun Yuan suddenly fell silent. After a while, he said, Azure Saint told you about this? Zhang Yan smiled and said, if there is any difficulty, just pretend that I did not ask. Taoist Sun Yuan thought for a while and said, it is not convenient for me to comment on this matter. I only have one thing to say. Even if it is the treasure spirit of creation, it may not necessarily be your enemy. Zhang Yan looked at him for a while and nodded. Taoist Sun Yuan cupped his hands, said goodbye, and left. Zhang Yan thought for a while and realized that Taoist Sun Yuan probably had some connection with the treasure spirit of creation. Taoist Qing Sheng probably knew about this and deliberately told him about it so that Zhang Yan would have some misgivings about this person. However, as long as they did not make an enemy of him, he did not need to care about their identity. He turned his mind and immersed his consciousness in Bushutian once again. He had learned a lot from his conversation with Qing Sheng and understood that Bushutian was a place he could rely on. In this case, if he could make use of Bushutian and take control of this place, he would have a place he could rely on. When that time came, he would not need to be too afraid of external enemies. After Taoist Sun Yuan bade farewell to Zhang Yan, he returned to the frozen present world. When he saw the Taoist, he told him about their conversation. The Taoist sighed and said, "Speaking of which, we have never helped this Taoist Zhang before. We only warned him a few times, which is a small matter. His words are understandable, but I am afraid that he has been bewitched by Qing Sheng and sees me as an enemy." Taoist Sun Yuan slowly said, "Perhaps we have done wrong from the beginning." The Taoist looked at him and said, "What do you mean, Taoist Zhang?" Taoist Sun Yuan said in a deep voice, "I think I should let Taoist Zhang know about all my plans." When he saw that the Taoist was silent, he continued, "Previously, we have been thinking of doing him a favor and then trying to win him over. But I think it is better to be sincere about this matter. Whether Taoist Zhang agrees or refuses, it is better to let him know that we are not enemies. In the face of a common enemy, we can even help each other." The Taoist thought for a long time and finally nodded. "Perhaps Taoist Zhang is right. I have been too cautious in the past. But now, this Taoist Zhang may not believe me. It is better to wait for a chance to talk about this matter." Chapter 1955. Zhang Yan's consciousness once again entered Busu Tian. This time, it was not only to comprehend the mysteries and improve his cultivation, but also to find a way to control this domain. Only then could he fight against the enemies from the outside. However, after immersing himself for a long time, just like the last time, he felt as if he was facing an ocean of chaos. His thoughts and consciousness could float up and down, but if he wanted to make it his own, he was unable to do so, and it always seemed empty and powerless. Ever since he achieved true yang, most things could be done with just a thought. It had been a long time since he had such a feeling. After an unknown amount of time, he still could not find a clue. He knew that this was not a solution, so he slowly withdrew and began to think. Just like how he could borrow Busu Tian's Weili to a certain extent by looking into the depths of Busu Tian, he believed that there must be a key here. As long as he controlled this place, he could control the entire Busu Tian. Just now, his consciousness wandered for a long time and searched deeper, but he still could not find it. He even felt a certain amount of pressure. From this situation, it seemed that his cultivation was not enough. Although he could sink in, he was still lacking from finding the thing. If he wanted to do this, it seemed that he first needed to improve his cultivation. If there was no other way, then he could only try to find more fragments of the essence of creation or work on his own cultivation. Fortunately, Busu Tian was different. It was where the essence of creation was, so as long as he guarded this place, he would naturally be able to do this. It could be said that there was no delay in either. Thus, like before, he focused on comprehending the mysteries and allowed the various truths of the great Tao to reflect on himself. However, he did not dare to immerse too deeply. If there was anything wrong, he would immediately withdraw, purify, and then repeat the process again. As he diligently cultivated, his cultivation also increased. However, after sensing and calculating, he was still very far from controlling Busu Tian. Although there was no past or future in Busu Tian, after withdrawing his consciousness, it would take time to understand the truths of the Great Tao. Although it was safe now, it did not mean that there would be no trouble. If he delayed for even a moment, it would give the enemies who were looking for Busu Tian more opportunities. He pondered, could it be that I really have to enter with my real body in order to enjoy great benefits? This was an extremely great temptation. If he were to enter, then the next time he came out, he might be able to fight against all of his peers. However, he was extremely vigilant towards this in his heart. Because if he were to enter it, then the slightest mistake would cause him to be unable to circulate and comprehend the truths of the Grand Tao in time. Thus, he would be passively fused into it, and he wouldn't be himself anymore. Moreover, he kept having the feeling that something was slightly off here. After thinking for a while, he decided to stop his cultivation for the time being. Instead, he would deduce and see if there were any areas that he had overlooked. After carefully deducing for a long time, he finally found the problem. If he entered directly, he would be protected by Bushutian, but he would also be restricted by him. First of all, entering and leaving would not be easy. In the past, when he broke through the barrier of the world to enter the inner realm, it would take years or even decades. Now that he had to face Bushutian, he would have to face the same situation. Although there would be no past or future when he comprehended here, he would still be delayed when he wanted to leave. Most importantly, if he didn't make it out in time, he would be completely lost in this place. However, he also thought that since the Azure Saint dared to say that he needed to enter the inner realm to hide, then perhaps he wouldn't be affected by the Azure Saint. However, it was also possible that the treasure on his body could protect him. Thinking about this, he thought, it seems like I can only try to pass the inner realm first and see if I can enter with my real body. However, the problem was that it was too slow to rely on just comprehending the essence of creation. That was why he believed that he could only focus on seeking his own path in order to increase his cultivation in the shortest amount of time. He immediately split off a sliver of his consciousness and began to observe his own body. The way to seek one's own path was to rely on oneself and look forward to the Grand Tao. However, this was not something that could be done out of thin air. If one couldn't find the right direction, then even if one could increase their cultivation, the increase would be minimal. Only by finding the right path could one increase their cultivation. If there was a comparison, the former was like scattering one's power aimlessly. Although it was boundless, the harvest was very small. The latter was concentrating one's power in one place and moving in one direction. This way, the results would quickly be seen. However, at the same time, all the obstacles in seeking one's own path came from one's self. If one's cultivation was not firm enough, then it was likely that they would frequently encounter obstacles in the future. Once they couldn't get past them, they would begin to doubt themselves, and their cultivation would likely never increase again. That was why one couldn't be too eager for quick success. One had to know one's own strength and always be clear about one's own path. It was no wonder that Taoist Zhang Yuan and the Yao Han ancestor chose to seek one of the two paths instead of cultivating both. This was not only because the two paths seemed different on the surface, but it was also to avoid more variables during cultivation. However, he believed that clinging to a single path was a kind of fear in itself. It was the persistence of one's Tao heart that led to the dangers of the path later on. It was not the other way around. As long as one had the right Tao heart, these could be avoided. For example, Qing Sheng's Tao heart was to cut off all external objects. Yao Han and the others sought external help, but the Tao heart was to regain the essence of creation and reopen the door to the Grand Tao. The path he chose was different from the two, so what should his Tao heart be? He couldn't help but think of the time when he entered the heavenly cave. In order to create a method that didn't require external objects, this method could actually be regarded as seeking one's own self. But even if one didn't need external objects to cultivate, living in the world, one couldn't do without external needs. Therefore, abandoning external objects was not absolute. It was just to get rid of a certain aspect of the shackles and find a better way out. Fundamentally speaking, as long as one didn't transcend, there wasn't much difference. As soon as this thought emerged in his mind, his thoughts suddenly straightened out, and he felt that the path ahead was a little clearer. If there was self, then there was existence. If there was outside, then there was the Tao. His own Tao heart should be the same as the Tao. Once the Tao heart was established, there was a clear path to follow and there were no doubts ahead. He no longer hesitated. He began to observe himself and began to improve his cultivation from another direction. Just as he was cultivating, his disciple, Wei Zihong, was coming to Xianyuan heaven. Before Zhang Yan said that he was searching for the upper realm, he had left a doppelganger in the world. Therefore, in the eyes of the disciples, although he had gone to seek the upper realm, it felt like he hadn't really left. If there was nothing important, the disciples wouldn't come to disturb him. But not long ago, several sects in the mountain and sea realm, including Qinsang school, had suddenly experienced some unpredictable strange phenomena. The upper echelons of the sects still couldn't come to a conclusion. Fortunately, Zhang Yan, a true yang expert, was overseeing things, so they could ask for help. Therefore, they asked Wei Zihong to come and ask about this matter. Not long after, Wei Zihong arrived in front of the main hall of Qinghuan Palace. As soon as he landed, he saw Jing Yu standing there. He stepped forward and cupped his hands. "Senior brother Jing, is Master here?" Jing Yu smiled. "Master knows that senior brother Wei is coming, so he specially ordered me to wait here." Wei Zihong said, "I'll have to trouble senior brother Jing." But at this time, he suddenly sensed that Jing Yu's aura seemed to be very different from before, as if he wasn't a member of this world. He didn't think too much about it. Jing Yu was his master's personal attendant, so he should be able to get some benefits. He stepped into the hall and saw Zhang Yan sitting on the jade platform. He stepped forward and bowed. "Disciple pays his respects to master." Zhang Yan smiled. "Dispense with the formalities. Disciple has come today for something else." Wei Zihong bowed and said, "Reporting to master, disciple has come to ask for master's help." The memorial tablets of the three sects, Qinsang, Shaoqing, and Netherworld, all shook at the same time. However, the sect masters and elders couldn't figure out the reason, so they asked disciple to come and ask why there was such a strange phenomenon. Zhang Yan listened and fell into deep thought. Nothing in the world could be hidden from him, especially such a change. But in order to deal with the attack of ancestor Yao Han and the others, to ensure that the karma wasn't stolen too much, he purposely cut off the connection with the present world and didn't ask too much. In reality, if there weren't people in the present world, he wouldn't care too much about it. But now that he heard about it, he had a feeling that it might be because he was comprehending Busu's genius. He calculated in his heart, but it was a blur in front of him. He thought for a while and didn't continue to pursue the matter. The patriarchs and the unfathomable owner of the devil treasury should have made some arrangements on the 9 continents that day, and it might have involved Busu. But from his point of view, it wasn't as simple as pouring his consciousness into the present world. And these almighty beings wouldn't make such arrangements for no reason. If the time wasn't right, it was best not to take the initiative, or it might cause some undesirable changes. He said, "I understand. When you go back, you can tell the leaders of the sects that this matter is not a problem. Tell them not to worry." Wei Zihong said yes. Now that the matter was over, he asked for guidance on the Tao. After half a month of questioning, his doubts were all resolved, and he left. But when he came out, he suddenly found that his master was different from what he had seen before. His master's qi was more mysterious, but he didn't notice it at all. He stopped and couldn't help but ask, "Senior brother Jing, is master already?" Jing Yu looked at him, nodded, and said in a low voice, "Master has returned, but there is a problem now, so it's not time to tell him. It's better if only Shangzhen knows." Wei Zihong's heart trembled. He took a deep breath and looked back at the Holy Ji Palace. He did not expect his master to have made it this far. He was both surprised and excited. At the same time, he felt a sense of heaviness in his heart. Something that could make someone of his master's level of cultivation need to be treated with caution must not be something simple. He cupped his hands at Jing Yu and went to the lower worlds. Chapter 1956. After Wei Zihong retreated, Zhang Yan's consciousness turned and returned to his main body. He discovered that in that moment, the jade plate in his main body's hand seemed to have moved a little, but when he examined it again, there was no movement at all. He guessed that it was likely to be related to those strange phenomena. He thought for a moment. Since he had decided to ignore this matter, there was no need to investigate further. Not to mention that he could not see the reason behind it. Even if he could find the answer, he might not have the ability to solve it. Cultivation was the most important thing for him at the moment. These questions could be explored in the future as long as he had enough cultivation and magic power. Now that he was pursuing two paths at the same time, his cultivation had improved much faster than before. However, this was the limit of what he could do at the moment. It was impossible to go any faster. His magic power and cultivation were improving every moment. Ever since he stepped on the path of cultivation, he had not experienced such a situation for a long time. But although he kept going deeper into Bushutian, it was endless. It seemed that he would never be able to find the important place. He was very patient about this. The creation essence was in his hands. As long as he tried to protect it and cultivate step by step, he would eventually achieve his goal. As for the arrival of external enemies, there was no way to avoid it. Fortunately, he was improving every moment. The later this generation came, the easier it would be to deal with it. As he fully immersed himself in it, he gradually kept the external inside, and the level of his magic power also quietly rose and changed during this process. He didn't know how much time had passed, but at a certain moment, he felt a familiar magic power approaching him. He woke up from his deep meditation and opened his eyes to see that the person who had come was Daoist Zhanyuan. The latter cupped his hands and said, "Greetings, fellow Daoist. I'm here to disturb you again." Zhang Yan smiled, shook his sleeves, and stood up to return the bow. This person had been looking for him repeatedly. If there was no accident, it should be because of Bushutian, who was behind him. However, this person was much more reasonable than the Yao Han ancestor. He did not use forceful methods, but always tried to repay kindness. Although he had his own motives, since the beginning of their relationship, he had never suffered a loss. On the contrary, he had benefited a lot from this person, so he did not hesitate to greet him. Taoist Zhanyuan said, "Fellow Taoist once asked me why I was looking for you." Zhang Yan smiled and said, "Oh. Fellow Taoist, are you finally willing to speak frankly?" From the beginning to the end, he had never indicated that he wanted to stand with the other party. He had thought that the other party would not tell him everything without a definite answer. He did not expect that the other party would take the initiative to bring it up. However, he thought that the other party would definitely not do this for no reason. Either something had happened that caused the original attitude to change, or he had encountered some difficulties and urgently needed his help. Taoist Zhanyuan cupped his fist again and said, "I'd like to invite you to meet someone. Would you be willing?" Zhang Yan's interest was piqued. He was afraid that the person behind Taoist Zhanyuan was the key. He said, "Since fellow Daoist has sincerely invited me, I will go with you." Taoist Zhanyuan's face lit up and he said, "However, I'm afraid that you can't go there with your real body. You need to go with your virtual body." Fearing that Zhang Yan would misunderstand, he added, "I didn't do this on purpose. That place is a fixed world. With fellow Daoists' current cultivation, it will be difficult for you to restrain your magic power. I'm afraid that it will be difficult for you to enter." Zhang Yan's interest was piqued when he heard this. He needed to improve his strength as soon as possible in order to comprehend the cultivation method and deal with external enemies. Therefore, he had no intention of leaving this place. Therefore, he immediately used his divine will and created a virtual shadow doppelganger to follow Taoist Zhanyuan. The virtual doppelganger gradually moved away from the magic power fluctuations in his body. After an unknown period of time, the area in front of him suddenly became empty. The many spirit cultivation Weili that he could sense in the past also became very faint. He understood that the other party must have blocked it. At this time, Taoist Zhanyuan gestured, "Fellow Daoist, please look. This is where we are going." Zhang Yan looked in the direction he was pointing and saw a stagnant world that looked like amber. There was no distinction between the past and the future. This should be the fixed world that Taoist Zhanyuan had mentioned. He was not completely ignorant about this because the fusion of the spirit cultivation Dharma power would inevitably make him understand more things. However, he had never formally come into contact with it, so it was difficult for him to understand its mysteries. This time, he could take the opportunity to observe it. When Taoist Zhanyuan saw him staring at this place, he explained, "Fellow Daoist, this fixed world can only be opened by a Taoist cultivator who has broken through the stubborn truth. If we stay here, our magic power will not collide with the outside world. Therefore, it will be difficult for outsiders to find out where we are. This place can be used as a shelter. Zhang Yan nodded slightly. He now understood why Taoist Zhang Yuan said that it was not good to go to this place with his real body. In the nothingness, there was a distinction between the distance and the distance because of the confrontation of the spirit cultivation Dharma power. It was impossible to go to a place where one's magic power could not reach. Because the other party's magic power had completely concealed this place and was hidden in an extremely deep place, it meant that even if there was someone guiding him, he could not go there with his own strength. Presumably, only those who had broken through the stubborn truth could find each other. However, he also knew that what he saw at this moment was only the surface. There must be more complicated things hidden here. He asked, how many places like this are there in the nothingness? Taoist Zhang Yuan shook his head and said, it's hard to know. In the nothingness, it's not certain whether there are or not. Fellow Taoist will understand when you have obtained the power. But don't worry, this place of fixed world is usually difficult for outsiders except for those who are on good terms with us. When Zhang Yan heard this, he could not help but laugh in his heart. He thought of the last time when Qing Xing bid farewell to him. Taoist Yu Qiu came to ask for the treasure and said that he could come to the Cangqing fixed world to look for him. According to Zhang Yuan, it was obvious that he had made up his mind not to return it. But to say that such a place was difficult for outsiders to get close to was not necessarily true. Qing Xing should also be able to open up such a place, but he still thought that he needed to use Busu Tian to protect himself. This showed that the fixed world was not without flaws, at least in the face of the danger that he mentioned, there was no way to resist. At this time, Taoist Zhang Yuan bowed to the fixed world and said, fellow Taoist, the guest has arrived. After a short while, a voice was heard from inside, saying, it's difficult for me to come out to welcome the guest, so I'll have to trouble you to invite the guest in for a chat. Taoist Zhang Yuan said yes and made an inviting gesture, saying, fellow Taoist, please come with me. As he said this, he took the lead and walked inside. Zhang Yan waved his sleeves and followed behind. Then, he saw that the frozen world started to move, as though it was flowing. When he saw this, he couldn't help but ponder. If there was a movement in the real world, there would be the ebb and flow of life and death. The so-called frozen world was not unchanging. This was a flaw, but at the same time, it was a way for him to survive. Otherwise, if an external force destroyed this world, the person hiding in it would disappear together with him. While he was thinking, the scene before his eyes flashed, and he had already entered the fixed world. He saw that it was extremely monotonous, with no living creatures. The world was divided into two colors, black and white, and a Taoist in a loose robe was sitting in the yin and yang qi. Taoist Zhang Yuan said, this is Taoist Xinchang. The Taoist looked gentle and polite. He bowed to Zhang Yan from a distance and said, greetings, fellow Taoist. Please forgive me for not being able to get up. Taoist Zhang Yuan explained, Taoist Xinchang is confined here because of his cultivation method. I am not treating you unkindly. Zhang Yan could see that the Taoist seemed to have sealed himself in this place, and the Taoist robe on his body seemed to be a treasure. He bowed back and said, no problem. Taoist Xinchang opened his sleeves and said, fellow Taoist, are you wondering why I am doing this? Zhang Yan smiled and said, indeed, I am a little confused. Taoist Xinchang pointed to himself and said, fellow Taoist, you have seen my Taoist robe. This is my original body. Hearing this, Zhang Yan's eyes flickered slightly, and he immediately knew that this was the treasure spirit of creation that Azure Saint had mentioned. However, as long as the Taoist did not make an enemy of him, he did not care about his background. Moreover, the Taoist seemed to have something to ask of him, so his expression was normal. After Taoist Xinchang said this, he saw that Zhang Yan did not show any hostility, just like when they met just now. He could not help but relax a little, knowing that he could continue the conversation. He sighed and said, after I killed the stubborn truth, I thought I had passed this hurdle. Unfortunately, I did not expect that I actually had two consciousnesses. Originally, neither of us was aware of the other's existence, but once the stubborn truth was lost, we could sense each other. However, we had different views on the path of Tao, which was extremely extreme and regarded Tao as an enemy. Fortunately, I was occupying the main body at that time, so I sealed myself to avoid being implicated. When Zhang Yan heard this, he finally understood that natural treasure spirits possessed stubbornness as well. But when he thought about it, it was indeed so. Even if it was a treasure spirit born from the essence of creation, it would still possess traces of existence before it manifested, and it would naturally be different after it fused and transformed. Taoist Xinchang's situation was indeed a big problem. He had two separate consciousnesses, but their Tao perceptions were different. If he did not solve this problem, he was afraid that he would not be able to do anything. He said, "Those two Taoist friends invited I here. Is it related to this?" Taoist Xinchang said, "Yes." Taoist Zhang Yuan said, "Taoist friend Xinchang and the other one are now taking turns to control the body." At first, they were in a stalemate, but the other one used some unknown method to make his cultivation level higher than Taoist friend Xinchang's. Although it is not obvious at the moment, it will be difficult to suppress him in the long run. Taoist friend Xinchang has tried many methods, but to no avail. Later, he found that unless he can greatly improve his cultivation level and calculate the reason for this change, he will have a chance to gain the upper hand. Taoist Xinchang shook his head and said, "This is not the most troublesome thing." When the other one was in the body, he was still looking for other treasure spirits of creation. Although he has not found any results yet, if this continues, he will succeed sooner or later. At this time, Taoist Zhang Yuan solemnly bowed to Zhang Yan and said, "Now, only the essence of creation in your hand can save Taoist friend Xinchang." Chapter 1957. Zhang Yan listened to their conversation but did not respond immediately. Instead, he was deep in thought. Taoist Xinchang's consciousness was split into two and his body was the only one. Logically speaking, no matter which side had the upper hand, their mana and cultivation level should be the same. The current situation was probably related to the manifestation of the treasure. Although he did not know the reason behind it, if it was a cultivator with a human body, it would not be like this. He would have found out about this during his cultivation and either solved the problem beforehand or he had already made the necessary arrangements. From the looks of it, although the treasure spirit of creation was blessed by nature, it was only because of the essence of creation. In terms of cultivation level, it might not be as good as those cultivators who cultivated properly. However, if it was as he said, the other consciousness had already connected to an outsider, it would be a big problem. Now that Taoist Xinchang knew that he had the land of creation essence in his hands, the other consciousness should also know about it. If he did not resolve this matter, then in the worst-case scenario, he would not only have to deal with Taoist Xinchang, who was possessed by the evil consciousness, but he would also have to deal with the other treasure spirit that had manifested. On the surface, the best thing to do now was to help him suppress the other consciousness. Then, he would be able to solve the problem smoothly. Even if there was an outsider, he would be the one to deal with it first. However, he did not respond immediately because there were too many things to think about. Seeing that he didn't answer, Shen Lian guessed that he was weighing the pros and cons here. He said sincerely, "I know it's difficult for you, Taoist friend. I don't want to devour the essence of creation. I just want to borrow it for a while." He then said, "After I attain Tao, this treasure body has been shed. If you are willing to help me solve this problem, I am willing to give it to you as a token of appreciation." Zhang Yan was non-committal. According to Qing Sheng, as long as one had a treasure of fate, he would be invincible against his peers. Since he had said so, it was highly possible that he could even kill Qian Wanzhen. However, Zhang Yan could tell that Qing Sheng and the others did not have much confidence in this and just wanted to give it a try. However, the matter of consciousness was the hardest to figure out. What if the consciousness of the person in front of him had already been restrained by the consciousness of the other side and was only using words to deceive him? Of course, it was also possible that he himself didn't know about it, but the problem here was even more serious. Now that its cultivation was inferior to the other consciousness, would it help the other consciousness to improve its cultivation after obtaining the essence of creation? There were simply too many variables in this situation. He had no interest in creating a powerful enemy after offering up the item. Even if the other party took out a supreme treasure, it would still be the same. In fact, if the other party wanted to tamper with it, even the supreme treasure itself wouldn't be trustworthy. Seeing that he did not speak for a long time, Taoist Sun Yuan said, "I wonder what fellow Taoist thinks." Taoist Xinchang added, "You don't have to worry, fellow Taoist. The creation essence belongs to you after all. If you don't want to, we won't force you." Zhang Yan sternly said, "Forgive I for speaking bluntly, but in this matter, it is difficult to prove that what the two of them said is true with just words." Taoist Xinchang wasn't displeased by his words. Instead, he said, "You're right, fellow Taoist. It's only right to be cautious. We shouldn't rush to a conclusion. So, how do you think we should distinguish this matter?" Zhang Yan looked at the two of them and said, "I want to see the other one." "Is that possible?" This. Taoist Xinchang hesitated for a moment. "It's not impossible, but," Taoist Sun Yuan said, "fellow Taoist, the two consciousnesses are constantly alternating. Fellow Taoist Xinchang doesn't know when the other one will come out. Moreover, every time it comes out, its strength increases a little." Zhang Yan looked at Xinchang and said, "Will this one overwhelm you the next time it comes out?" Xinchang thought about it carefully and said, "Although it improves every time, I can still suppress it. But if you want to see it, I'm afraid you'll have to wait for a long time." He also knew that he couldn't win Zhang Yan's trust with just a few words. Only by seeing the truth would he be able to convince him. However, he couldn't take the initiative to let the other consciousness occupy him, because the other consciousness's cultivation had suddenly increased a lot. This made it necessary for him to increase his cultivation as much as possible when he took control of the main body so that he wouldn't fall too far behind. Only then could he suppress this place and prevent it from escaping. Zhang Yan was very interested in the other consciousness. He wanted to see how it did all this and whether it was as he had guessed. He said, "It doesn't matter. I came here with an illusory body, so I can wait here." Seeing that he was willing to wait, Taoist Xinchang cupped his hands to Taoist Sun Yuan and said, "Fellow Taoist, please guard outside. Fellow Taoist Zhang and I can stay here." Taoist Sun Yuan also cupped his hands and said, "Then I'll take my leave first." Then, his figure turned dark and gradually disappeared. Zhang Yan felt that there was a dull and oppressive feeling in this world, but after Taoist Sun Yuan left, it became relaxed again. He immediately understood that the presence of another deity refinement cultivator would put a lot of pressure on this world, so he wouldn't be able to stay for too long. Taoist Xinchang pointed his finger, and a palace appeared out of thin air. A lotus seat also appeared in front of Zhang Yan. He said, "Just now, I've been too busy talking. Please sit down and talk, fellow Taoist." Zhang Yan flicked his sleeves and sat down, then began to talk with Taoist Xinchang. Taoist Xinchang's treasure spirit had manifested. Through this conversation, Meng Qi learned a lot about this generation's secrets. Now that he had returned, he didn't need to mention anything else. After an unknown period of time, Taoist Xinchang suddenly said in a serious tone, "He's coming soon. Fellow Taoist, you must be careful. If he comes out and makes some promises, fellow Taoist, you must not be deceived by his words." Zhang Yan felt that his qi was declining, so he knew that he was telling the truth. He said, "Rest assured, fellow Taoist. I will not act recklessly." Taoist Xinchang slowly lowered his head. Zhang Yan waited for a while before he noticed that his vital energy had suddenly become different. When he looked over once more, he noticed in a daze that he'd already transformed into a 7 or 8-year-old boy, but he'd already been replaced by another consciousness. However, this change in body shape was controlled by the mind, and it only took a thought. Meng Qi only needed to identify the person's qi to know who it was. It didn't matter what the person looked like. The boy's eyes were innocent and clear. He looked at Meng Qi with great curiosity and said, "Are you sent by my brother to deal with me?" Zhang Yan carefully analyzed and found that Taoist Xinchang had indeed changed his consciousness. If the previous one was reserved and had the demeanor of a gentleman, then this one was innocent and lively, just like a child. Moreover, the moment he opened his mouth, he called Taoist Xinchang as his brother. It seemed that the relationship between the two consciousnesses was not that simple. He smiled and said, "It is true that I was invited here, but I have not promised to deal with anyone yet." Taoist Xinchang was enlightened, "Is that so?" He then stood up and opened up his short arms. With anticipation, he asked, "Then can you help me get out of here?" Zhang Yan noticed that Taoist Xinchang was able to stand up, which meant that his cultivation level was much higher than Taoist Xinchang's. He smiled and said, "Although I did not promise anything, I am still a guest invited by your brother. Why should I help you get out of here?" Taoist Xinchang looked troubled as if he was trying to figure out how to convince him. Zhang Yan did not wait for him to speak and continued, "I am curious. You and my brother should have been cultivating at the same time, so why is your cultivation level higher?" Initially, he wanted to observe the mysteries of this on his own. However, after interacting with this person, he felt that if he were to ask directly, this person would most likely tell him the answer. As expected, Taoist Xinchang felt like he was being praised. He raised his head and said, "That is because I am walking on the right path." Zhang Yan asked again, "What is the right path?" Taoist Xinchang felt strange and said, "The right path is the right path." Zhang Yan thought about it for a while. Even though what Taoist Xinchang said seemed like he did not say it, but he understood something. The treasure spirits of creation were different from normal cultivators. As beings that were born with great Weili, they should be born with a Tao to follow, which was the so-called right path. However, the choice made by Taoist Xinchang was probably contrary to this. Taoist Xinchang was only following his heart. He knew how it was, but he did not know why. If he were to discuss Tao with him, he would not be able to get anything out of it. Therefore, he did not dwell on it and went back to the main topic. "If you could get out of here, what would you do?" Taoist Xinchang answered without hesitation, "Of course I would follow my heart." This time, the answer that Zhang Yan heard did not contain any truth, but he could understand the meaning behind it. It was not wrong to act according to one's heart, but if one did not know restraint, one would do whatever one wanted. If a person with a high level of mana and Tao were to act like this, it would be a disaster for both the person and oneself. However, Taoist Xinchang did not think that it was wrong. Instead, he thought that it was the right thing to do for just now. He continued, "I heard that you have summoned a fellow cultivator to help you. Even if I did not do anything, you would still have a chance to get out of here." Taoist Xinchang bit his finger and said, "But I did not summon him to help me get out of here." Zhang Yan smiled and said, "Oh? If that's not the case, then why did you call this person over?" Taoist Xinchang answered seriously, "I summoned him to eat him, of course. In this way, I can increase my Tao and get out of here earlier." Zhang Yan's eyes flickered a little. Although it was a short sentence, it revealed a lot of information. Taoist Xinchang could increase his Tao by devouring other treasures, but it was not known if it was a unique ability of him or if it was the same for all treasure spirits of creation. Another thing was that the two consciousnesses of Taoist Xinchang did not know each other. Taoist Xinchang could only vaguely feel the intention of the other consciousness, but he did not understand its real intention. The reason why Taoist Xinchang's Tao could be higher than the other consciousness was that he had already gained some benefits, or even devoured a treasure spirit. Chapter 1958. Zhang Yan suddenly realized that because of the two intents in one body, Xinchang Taoist might know what Xinchang Taoist knew as well. There were some things that Xinchang Taoist didn't want to talk about, but Xinchang Taoist didn't. He could take this opportunity to ask some questions. Thinking about this, he said, "When I was talking with fellow Zhan Yuan, I noticed that he was secretly worried, as if a disaster could come at any time. Do you know the reason?" Xinchang Taoist asked curiously, "Didn't my brother tell you about this?" Zhang Yan smiled and said, "Fellow Xinchang Taoist, we haven't known each other for a long time. What we talked about was all about Tao, but never about these things." Xinqiang Daoist said proudly, I know, I know. Zhang Yan saw him holding his head high as if to ask him questions, and he couldn't help but laugh. He was indeed innocent, but it was also because of this that if he was allowed to go out, just now would be the most terrifying. He said, then I have to ask. Xinqiang Daoist said with a serious face, that is because there is a person in the void who doesn't exist yet. If he comes out, he will endanger our fellow Taoists. If we don't have someone to fight against him, we will be destroyed by him and fall into eternal silence. However, if there is no change in the void, then this person may not appear. The reason why fellow Zhan Yuan is worried is that the change has already appeared, and the possibility of this person appearing has greatly increased. Zhang Yan was deep in thought. The so-called person who had yet to exist was not actually referring to the future, but rather that this person was bound to appear. Moreover, this person was already known by many in the same path. It was just that the opportunity had yet to arrive, so this person had yet to appear in front of others. As for the variable, it was very likely that it was referring to Bushutian, who was behind him. This was because the creation essence of this place was very unique, and even the Tai Ming ancestral master had left his mark there. Of course, this was only his conjecture, and there might be something he didn't know, so there was no need to ask. It didn't matter if this was the case or not, as long as the person hadn't appeared yet, there was still enough time to prepare. He asked again, if fellow Daoist is successful, how will you treat your brother? Boy Xinqiang was confused and said, if I succeed, you will walk the righteous path with me. What else do you need? Zhang Yan immediately understood. Although the other party's consciousness was divided into self and brother, he did not feel that there was anything wrong with the contract between the two. Perhaps from the other party's point of view, swallowing priest Xinqiang meant that he would be able to walk in the same place as himself. It did not matter whether priest Xinqiang had an independent consciousness or not. He couldn't help but think that it was impossible to let Xinqiang Boy escape, but it wasn't necessarily a good thing to completely suppress Xinqiang Boy. It could be seen that Xinqiang Daoist himself did not have much confidence in this matter. Therefore, after the two consciousnesses merged into one, there was no guarantee that the master would control the body. In the end, Xinqiang Daoist's consciousness would have the upper hand, and that would be very inappropriate. The only thing they could do now was to maintain the status quo and strike a balance between the two. Just now was the best. Seeing that he did not speak for a long time, Boy Xinqiang moved forward a little, raised his head and stared at him with his eyes wide open. Seeing him like this, Zhang Yan smiled and said, I wonder what kind of person fellow Daoist is summoning. Boy Xinqiang bit his finger again, grunted and said, he looks a bit like Big Brother. Zhang Yan thought for a moment. What he meant was not that the person looked like priest Xinqiang, but that both of them were transformed from the treasure spirit of creation. Therefore, they were similar in nature. It was even possible that the person was the same as priest Xinqiang, a person who followed his own nature and pursued his own Tao. He asked again, then when will he come? Boy Xinqiang shook his head and said, I don't know. I am only summoning him. Whether he comes or not, I have no control over it. Zhang Yan said, since he has not come, have you not thought of changing to another person? Boy Xinqiang frowned and showed a distressed expression. He said, I can't find a suitable person. Zhang Yan asked a few more questions and understood that Boy Xinqiang could only find someone who had the same level of mana and cultivation as him. That way, it would be easier for Zhang Yan to devour. However, from another perspective, the person who could be summoned was naturally the most suitable. If the person's cultivation was too high, it would be difficult to deal with the person. Boy Xinqiang suddenly twitched his mouth and said, Big Brother is coming out. Then, he sat down obediently and hugged his knees with his two little hands. After a while, the qi dynamic on his body changed again. As a ray of light flashed, he returned to his original appearance of priest Xinqiang. However, he looked tired. He looked up at Zhang Yan and asked, Fellow Daoist, have you seen that person? Zhang Yan nodded and said, Yes, I have. How are you? He could see that the reason why Priest Xinchang could replace Boy Xinchang so quickly was because he had forcibly used the power of the seal that was set up beforehand. He was actually fighting against himself. Otherwise, with his endless mana, he would not have ended up like this. Priest Xinchang straightened out his qi dynamic and stood up. He bowed and said, "Thank you for your concern. It's just a small trick. It won't be a big deal." Then, he looked up and said with some anticipation, "Since you have seen that person, you should know that what I said is true. I wonder if you are willing to help me now." Zhang Yan thought for a while and said, "I think that what you have thought is not a good choice." Priest Xinchang was startled, but he did not get angry. He raised his hand and asked seriously, "May I ask why?" When he discussed the Tao earlier, he'd noticed that even though Zhang Yan's cultivation was inferior to his, but because Zhang Yan's ability was obtained through his own cultivation and not a gift from the heavens, Zhang Yan's understanding of the Tao was much deeper and more thorough than his own in certain aspects. So she didn't dare disregard Zhang Yan's opinion. Zhang Yan mentioned some of the key points that he had considered. Other than the biggest problem of not having a clear consciousness, he was also unsure if Xinchang Daoist's enlightenment of Bu Su would bring about the advancement of Xinchang Daoist's cultivation. Priest Xinchang sighed. He had considered this before, but after discussing it with Priest Zhan Yuan, he believed that Boy Xinchang's cultivation would improve very quickly. As the advantage accumulated and expanded, he would eventually be unable to suppress him. This threat was right in front of him, so he had to take the risk. However, after listening to Zhang Yan's words, it seemed that there was another solution. He asked tentatively, "Then what does fellow Taoist think?" Zhang Yan said, "I think that fellow Taoist should maintain the current situation and not overpower either side." Priest Xinchang said with a serious expression, "It's not that I don't want to, but that one's cultivation is already higher than mine. If I don't think of a solution in time, I'm afraid I won't be able to resist." Zhang Yan smiled and said, "I think that fellow Taoist is worrying too much. That one's cultivation will not improve for no reason. After interacting with him, I believe that he swallowed a primordial treasure spirit. Now that he is still improving, it should be because he hasn't used up all his energy. When the energy is exhausted and he doesn't have a chance to swallow it, this situation will not happen again." Priest Xinchang was a little surprised. Then, he seemed to think of something and began to calculate. After a while, he sighed and said, "I see. I have overlooked this." After his explanation, Zhang Yan learned that after the good fortune essence shattered, not all of the treasure spirits were able to manifest. In fact, most of the treasure spirits didn't even have the chance to be born. They were only treasured embryos that became food for the treasure spirits that manifested. Xinchang Daoist had also obtained one in his early years, but he did not walk this path, so he only sealed it somewhere. Presumably, it was this one that was devoured by Xinchang Daoist. The reason why he did not think about it was because after he chose another path, he was afraid that he would unknowingly walk the same old path, so he covered up his memories of this matter. But now, with Zhang Yan's reminder, these thoughts resurfaced in his heart. He sighed and said, "I have been too careless. Just now, I have given him a chance. If he really managed to escape, it would be a great sin." Zhang Yan said, "Fellow Taoist, in order to stop that one from coming out, you did not hesitate to trap yourself. What is your sin? Now, fellow Taoist only needs to wait until that one's cultivation stops improving, then you can pass this trial." Priest Xinchang smiled bitterly and said, "But I'm afraid that I won't be able to hold on until then." Zhang Yan said, "If fellow Taoist can't suppress it by yourself, why don't you find someone to help?" Priest Xinchang said awkwardly, "This is very difficult to do. We can only rely on ourselves. If we ask for help from others, even if their mana comes, they may clash with each other. Even fellow Taoist Zhan Yuan can't stay in my peaceful world for long. Otherwise, that one wouldn't have had the chance to swallow the baby." Zhang Yan smiled and said, "Since I said so, I naturally have a solution." He opened his palm and called out in his heart. In a flash, the image of a dazzling golden pearl appeared out of thin air. "This is the Tai golden pearl, and it was born from a place that contains the essence of creation. It can be said to be from the same source as fellow Taoist, yet it possesses boundless might, and it's even capable of carrying external forces. This humble Taoist can lend this treasure to fellow Taoist, and it doesn't matter whether fellow Taoist uses it to suppress or borrow its strength. Priest Xinchang was pleasantly surprised and said, "I've seen fellow Taoist use this treasure in battle, but I didn't know it was also born from the land of creation." Zhang Yan smiled. The Tai Golden Pearl's consciousness had long been erased by him, and it was also tainted by his aura. Unless it was someone who fought against him, it would be difficult to recognize it, and they would only think that it was refined from an ordinary creation fragment. He shook his sleeve and removed the shadow of the Golden Pearl. This was only a shadow, and without Priest Xinchang's permission, he could not summon this treasure into his body. Priest Xinchang was much more relaxed now. If he had this treasure to help him suppress it, then he could indeed hold on for a long time. A treasure refined from an ordinary creation fragment would be useless to him, but the Tai Golden Pearl was different. Fundamentally speaking, it was no different from him, but it could be of great help to him. Zhang Yan said, "The only variable now is the fellow Taoist that one summoned. At this moment, it is difficult to know whether he is a friend or a foe, and I don't know if he will come alone. To be safe, fellow Taoist should plan ahead." Chapter 1959. Zhang Yan thought that it would be easy to handle if there was only one person, but if there were two or more, it would not be so easy to deal with them. It was one thing for Xinchang Boy to swallow the precious fetus, which did not have any consciousness, but for those who were manifested by the treasure spirits, unless they were as pure and innocent as Xinchang Boy, who would come to them without knowing the situation. Logically speaking, he would definitely attract a few helpers to help him. Moreover, the other party might also want to swallow Xinchang Boy. Taoist Xinchang was aware of the severity of the matter, which was why he had risked his life to try and suppress the other consciousness. He hesitated for a moment before asking, "If the person who is coming is powerful, would you be willing to help?" Zhang Yan did not hesitate and immediately replied, "I will help." In order to protect Bushutian, he also needed allies. Now that he almost knew the purpose of Xinchang and Zhang Yuan, it did not conflict with him, so he could join forces. If he did not do anything and caused Xinchang priest to fail or lose his consciousness, he would definitely be implicated because of Bushutian. Therefore, helping Xinchang was equivalent to helping himself. Xinchang priest was very happy to hear this. He raised his hand and said, "Thank you, Taoist friend." He thought for a moment and said solemnly, "This is not a small matter. I need to find Taoist friend Zhang Yuan to discuss it together." Zhang Yan had no objection. Taoist Xinchang immediately transmitted his divine will. After a while, Taoist Zhang Yuan returned to this place. But this time, he didn't need to bring anyone with him. In order to avoid clashing with Taoist Xinchang's magic power, he also transformed into a shadow and came here. When he appeared where the two were, he asked Xinchang priest, "How is the matter, Taoist friend?" Taoist Xinchang briefly explained what had happened. Taoist Zhang Yuan could not help but sigh. Zhang Yan's advice was indeed useful, but it did not really solve the problem. The consciousness left behind was still a hidden danger. Zhang Yan saw through his thoughts and said with a smile, "Fellow Taoists, you don't have to worry about this. We will eventually find a solution to this matter. At the very least, we don't have to take the risk now." In his opinion, as long as there were no more primordial treasure spirits being devoured by boy Xinchang, he would be able to stop the source of the primordial treasure spirits. As long as priest Xinchang maintained his cultivation and did not break the balance would be maintained indefinitely. Taoist Zhang Yuan slowly said, "What fellow Taoist said makes sense. We have to protect the present, and we can only look for a solution in the future." Zhang Yan saw that he still could not let it go. He thought for a while and said, "If you really can't get rid of that person, then you don't have to think about getting rid of it. You can wait until Xinchang Fellow's cultivation surpasses that person, then you can try to separate that person's consciousness." Taoist Zhang Yuan's expression changed, and he said, "Fellow Taoist, do you mean to find a body for that person?" Zhang Yan nodded and said, "Since we can't coexist, then we'll separate. I heard from Xinchang fellow that there are still many creation-treasured embryos wandering in the void. We can find one and use it as a sustenance. Of course, the premise was that Taoist Xinchang's cultivation could surpass boy Xinchang's. Otherwise, it would be hard to say who would be separated. Taoist Xinchang pondered for a long time and found that this method was very feasible. He sighed and said, if we can't find a solution in the end, then this is the only way. Taoist Zhang Yuan also nodded. In any case, there was finally a way out. At this time, Taoist Xinchang bowed to them and said apologetically, thanks to your reminder this time, I didn't make a big mistake. I should have immediately offered this treasure to you, but I still need it to suppress that person, so I can't give it to you for the time being. Please forgive me, fellow Taoist. Zhang Yan smiled and said, I haven't solved your problem, so why do you need to do this? If we really solve this problem in the future, I won't refuse if you want to give it to me again. It seemed that he had gained nothing this time and even lent the Tai golden bead, but in fact, he had gained a lot from the Tao discussion. Moreover, the Tai golden bead was a Khanate supreme treasure. Because it had lost its consciousness, if he wanted to improve it, he would have to refine it repeatedly or fight against external forces. Now, it was equivalent to using Taoist Xinchang to do this, so strictly speaking, he was at an advantage. Taoist Xinchang said, the most important thing now is to find a way to stop that person from coming, just as fellow Taoist Zhang said. Taoist Zhang Yuan said in a low voice, I'm afraid that person is already here. Taoist Xinchang's expression froze, and he said, did you find something? Taoist Zhang Yuan said, just now, when I was guarding outside, I sensed a Dharma power spying on me. It was that person, but I drove him back. Taoist Xinchang said, if he can be driven away by you, then his Dharma power is below yours. Taoist Zhang Yuan said in a deep voice, it would be best if he retreated and didn't dare to come again. Zhang Yan shook his head. He believed that this matter could not be pinned on the enemy's considerations. It could not be said that Taoist Zhang Yuan's words were unreasonable. The other party might have come here with the intention of testing them, and it was obvious that they were on guard. If it were him, he would not take the risk of fighting with his peers if he did not have absolute confidence. After all, it was not like Su Ji had never manifested a treasure spirit before. But as long as there was a possibility that the other party would come to attack, they must not be careless. Taoist Xinchang pondered for a moment, and then said, there is one more thing that I wanted to discuss with fellow Taoist Zhang later. But given the current situation, I'm afraid I have to make it clear first. Zhang Yan said, if fellow Taoist has something to say, please say it. Taoist Xinchang said, I don't know if fellow Taoist has ever felt that in Su Ji, there will be a person who will invade and destroy all fellow Taoists. Zhang Yan smiled and said, I just now, when I was talking to someone, I happened to be told about this by him. Logically speaking, after he had discussed this matter with boy Xinchang, he should have sensed it. However, the strange thing was that he could not sense the existence of this person. He did not know whether it was because his cultivation was not complete or because of other reasons. Taoist Xinchang said in a low voice, since fellow Taoist understands, then there is no need for me to say more. Although this person has not shown himself, many fellow Taoists will not be as calm as before. Zhang Yan nodded. He could understand Taoist Xinchang's words. Previously, he did not know the existence of this person, so he could not see things clearly. But after understanding the situation, he was able to straighten it out. Because such a crisis could come at any time, spirit refinement cultivators would think of ways to improve their cultivation and strength in order to avoid being harmed by others. Previously, Ancestor Yao Han and the others had come to snatch Bu Su Tian time and time again. On one hand, it was because they coveted the treasure, and on the other hand, they were forced to do so, so they were not willing to give up. Another example would be those treasure spirits that had manifested. They would probably devour each other at a faster rate. It was hard to say if this was not the reason why Xinchang boy could easily attract the attention of his peers. Moreover, it could be expected that there would only be more fights between peers. Taoist Xinchang continued, even if the three of us work together, we may not be able to protect ourselves under such a situation. Therefore, I have come up with a plan. If we can succeed, we might be able to avoid this disaster. What is it, fellow Taoist? Zhang Yan asked. Taoist Xinchang solemnly said, I want to combine the incomplete creations of the world and find a way to gather them together. Even if I cannot gather all of them, I want to gather half of them. That way, I will be able to fight against that person. Zhang Yan raised his eyebrows. Taoist Xinchang was a person who sought after himself. Even if he were to change his path of cultivation, it would be useless. Hence, it was likely that he did not seek the fragment of good fortune for enlightenment, but for another purpose. Sure enough, Taoist Zhang Yuan explained on his behalf, fellow Taoist, please don't misunderstand. Fellow Taoist Xinchang didn't seek the good fortune fragment for the sake of studying Taoist techniques, but to use it to pave a way for him to survive. Zhang Yan thought that Bushutian could use it for protection, so he asked, could it be that you want to create a place where you will not be harmed? Taoist Xinchang nodded and said, yes. Taoist Zhang Yuan also said, since we don't seek external help, we've lost all the creation fragments that we've obtained. We hope that we can entrust them to the creation essence behind you. However, we don't know when the crisis will come. If we can't complete our task by then, would you allow us to enter and seek protection? Upon hearing this, Zhang Yan thought about it seriously. The request of these two was somewhat similar to Qing Sheng's. However, Bushutian had a master and disciples of the same sect in the present world. Before he could truly control the place where the creation essence was, he would not allow any of his peers to enter. He said, I cannot agree to your request now. When the time comes, I will give you a clear answer. Taoist Xinchang said, it is not an easy task to collect the creation fragments, and we do not know if we can do it. It is not too late to discuss this matter later. While the three of them were discussing, a person in a colorful robe stood in the void, looking at the place where Taoist Xinchang had created. His mana was firmly restrained within his body, and not a single strand of it was leaked out. His fluttering Taoist robe was empty, as if there was nothing inside it. Only his eyes shone brightly, as if they were real stars. At this moment, he heard a voice in his ear, was Taoist friends summoned by the person in here? Taoist Xinchang said, yes. His Qi-ji is hindered, and he must be under some kind of restriction. That voice said, could it be that a fellow Taoist deliberately lured you here? The bright-robed Taoist said, I have also considered this before. However, just now, a little bit of my mana leaked out and was blocked by another person. If it was a trap, he wouldn't have done such a thing. Hence, I deduced that he should be sealed here by someone. This kind of opportunity doesn't come often. That voice said, since he was able to block it, his mana must be above Taoist friends. Taoist Xinchang said, therefore, I need Taoist friends' help. That voice said, I am unable to leave now, but Taoist friend can follow my mana to find a fellow Taoist. This person has received a favor from me in the past, and should be able to help you. Chapter 1960. Although Taoist Xinchang's plan did not receive a clear response from Zhang Yan, the latter did not reject him outright. In order to make this matter as real as possible, he raised his hand, and a bright light shone in his palm. He said, this is a fragment of good fortune. I will leave it with you for now. Zhang Yan thought for a moment, then he waved his sleeve and kept it. He said, I can keep it for you. If fate allows it, it will fulfill your wish. If not, I will return it. Now he was cultivating the path of seeking self while observing the path of Bu Su Tian. His cultivation was improving very quickly, but he did not care about this fragment. After he brought it back to his original place, he would put it in Bu Su Tian. At that time, as long as he guarded the door, he would not be afraid of others taking it away. Taoist Xinchang relaxed when he saw him keep the fragment. He cupped his hands and said, then I will leave it to you. Zhang Yan said, if you want to find the fragment of good fortune, you will definitely have a conflict with others. Do you have a detailed plan? Taoist Zhang Yuan said, before Taoist Xinchang can get rid of that person, we are not going to make things difficult for you. Apart from the fragments in the hands of others, there are still many fragments of the essence of good fortune left in the void. It is better to find them here first. Zhang Yan nodded. It was indeed not a good time to have a conflict with others. However, the fragments of the essence of good fortune were very difficult to find. Those that fell in the present world would disappear in a flash if not invaded by the spirit refinement Weili. If they were not taken out, they would disappear together with the river of the present world when it collapsed. Although such things would not really disappear and would eventually appear again, no one would know where they would fall. Therefore, whether one could find them or not depended entirely on one's luck. Xinchang Daoist then said, I know of a world-seizing place. It was originally built by a friend of mine. After the creation essence was destroyed, he disappeared along with his friends. It's hard to say if he has fallen into eternal silence. However, at that time, I saw a creation spiritual light fall into the world-seizing place, and there should be a fragment left in it. I had no intention of disturbing this place in the past, but now I've gone to retrieve it. Speaking of this, he sighed and said, but doing so is very likely to lead to the collapse of this place. I am very sorry. Taoist Zhang Yuan comforted him, Taoist friend, the disaster is coming. Even if we do not move, that place may be targeted. It is better for us to take out the fragment as soon as possible. Taoist Xinchang nodded and looked at Zhang Yan, but I still have to trouble you here. Zhang Yan said, what do you need I to do? Taoist Xinchang said, the place has no owner, so we can break in from the outside. If everything goes well, we only need to open the door and use our magic power to invade it in an instant, then we can take out the essence of good fortune. But I am worried that the Taoist friend might have left behind some arrangements. If others find out, I am afraid that more variables will appear out of thin air. I hope that you and Taoist Zhang Yuan can go together and take out the fragment. Zhang Yan understood his worries. If they were to be careless and be noticed by the other spirit refinement cultivators, then under the current situation, it would most likely cause an intense battle, and this was precisely what they needed to avoid right now. He thought for a moment. Although it was a place that was called the world of good fortune, there was nothing wrong with just entering it with his consciousness. Therefore, he said, I agree. Taoist Xinchang was about to thank him, but suddenly, he frowned. Zhang Yan narrowed his eyes. Just now, he felt an inexplicable feeling, but soon it disappeared. He still didn't know why, but it appeared at this time, and it was very likely that it had something to do with the world of good fortune. Taoist Zhang Yuan's expression became solemn. He said, this seems to be a sign of danger. Zhang Yan thought for a moment and said, it's not necessarily a sign of danger. Moreover, if it really has something to do with the world of good fortune, we can't avoid it. Taoist Xinchang agreed with him and said, Taoist Zhang is right. This feeling is vague, and it is difficult to know where it is pointing. It is useless to avoid it. We don't need to be frightened by it. It is better to stick to our original plan. After the three of them discussed, they decided to act immediately to avoid too many variables. Taoist Xinchang pointed, and a spiritual light spread out in front of him. He said, the two of you will find the world of good fortune if you follow this path. Zhang Yan waved his sleeves and walked forward. He felt his body sink. When he looked up again, he found a stagnant world of good fortune in front of him. But compared to Taoist Xinchang's world of good fortune, it was much dimmer. At this time, Taoist Zhang Yuan appeared beside him. He also looked at the world of good fortune and said, Taoist friend, it should be here. But there is no one guarding this place. If the door is open, I am afraid it will collapse if we are not careful. We need to be careful later. Zhang Yan said yes. Taoist Zhang Yuan looked at it. After a moment, he saw the world of good fortune, which had been frozen and motionless, ripple like flowing water. This movement was equivalent to opening the door. But when the originally immutable thing changed, the long river of the world of good fortune began to flow. Since then, there had been ups and downs. If no one stopped it, it would not be far from death. The two of them instantly entered the world of good fortune and created two avatars. They joined hands and released their magic power in an attempt to occupy the world of good fortune. Once they succeeded, as long as there was a fragment of good fortune in this place, they could take it away. However, at this moment, the two of them felt that their mana was obstructed. It was another external force that was obstructing them. This should be the result of Dingshi opening the door. Another god refinement force shone over and then turned into a doppelganger in this place. But there were two of them here. As long as the other party was not here, it would not be difficult to suppress it. With the two of them working together, it did not take long for them to expel that wisp of consciousness. At this moment, Taoist Zhang Yuan sensed it and reached out to grab it. A moment later, a bright ball of light appeared in his palm. He had successfully found the fragment of good fortune. He handed it to Zhang Yan and said, "I'll leave it to you, Taoist friend." Zhang Yan took it and found that this fragment was slightly different from the ones he had seen before. It seemed to be clearer. He thought for a moment and understood that the fragments of good fortune had experienced many worlds of good fortune. According to Taoist Xinchang, this fragment had fallen here after the collapse of the essence of good fortune. It had not floated in other worlds of good fortune, so it could not be more pure. After obtaining this item, the two of them did not linger and retreated from the world of good fortune. Then, the world of good fortune gradually dimmed and soon dissipated into the void. When Taoist Zhang Yuan saw this, he could not help but sigh and said, "It seems that this Taoist friend is really not here anymore." As long as a spirit refinement cultivator was in the void, then this world of good fortune would have a consciousness and could be maintained. But now that it was gone, it was likely that the person had entered eternal silence. Zhang Yan watched quietly and did not say anything. If he had been able to comprehend the essence of good fortune on that day, the world of good fortune would have benefited greatly. It was just that he had not achieved his goal in the end. Since he had done this, he must have considered the consequences long ago. Seeing that this matter was over, he temporarily bid farewell to Taoist Zhang Yuan and returned his consciousness to his body. At the same time, he also brought back the two fragments and threw them into Bushutian with a flick of his sleeve. On the other side, Ancestor Yao Han and the other two were also searching for the fragments of good fortune. All of a sudden, they sensed a mysterious aura approaching them. Closely following that, they sensed an uncontrollable force approaching them. Taoist Yu Qiu said vigilantly, "There is an outsider here." Ancestor Yao Han said, "Don't be alarmed, the newcomer has no ill intentions. The first aura came from someone I know. Perhaps he needs my help with something, which led him here." Taoist Yu Lu said in a deep voice, "Based on that aura, this person is a treasure spirit." When spirit refinement cultivator's magic power clashed, many things could not be concealed, and he could immediately see through the other party's background. Taoist Yu Qiu frowned and said, "Fellow Taoist Yao Han. The creation treasure spirit is not on the same side as me." Ancestor Yao Han said, "Let's talk after we meet this person." Even though he said so, he did not let down his guard and stared at the source of the magic power. A moment later, the three saw a Taoist dressed in resplendent clothes appear in front of them. He bowed to them and said, "I am Yi Han." He looked at Ancestor Yao Han and said, "This must be fellow Taoist Yao Han." Fellow Taoist once owed a favor to a fellow Taoist. Ancestor Yao Han bowed back and said, "Of course I remember." Taoist Yi Han said, "Then please follow me to a place. Regardless of success or failure, the favor will be repaid." Ancestor Yao Han stood still and asked, "What is it?" In the spirit refinement realm, any oaths were useless. Even though he owed a favor, he did not have to repay it. Taoist Yi Han said, "I have a fellow Taoist trapped in a stopped world, and I need to help him escape. Coincidentally, there is someone guarding that place, and I can't defeat him, so I need your help." Ancestor Yao Han did not reply and looked at Taoist Yu Lu and said, "What do you think, fellow Taoist?" Taoist Yu Lu performed a hand seal and calculated, then frowned and said, "This matter seems to be related to that Taoist Zhang. Fellow Taoist, you need to be careful. Ancestor Yao Han's expression sank. After thinking for a moment, he bowed and said, "Forgive me for not being able to help fellow Taoist, but I advise fellow Taoist not to go." Taoist Yi Han asked curiously, "Why is that?" Ancestor Yao Han said, "This involves an opponent of ours. Although his cultivation isn't as high as ours, his magic power is extremely strong. The three of us have fought him several times, but we haven't been able to gain the upper hand. This matter is likely to involve someone else, so even if I go, it will be useless." Taoist Yi Han was surprised. If that was the case, he would have to think about it carefully. Ancestor Yao Han then said, "Moreover, it is not just one person. There is a Taoist who claims to be from Cangqing Xizing, and he seems to have made some sort of agreement with him. This person's magic power and cultivation are both above ours, and he took away all our artifacts. If we provoke him, we will not be able to resist him." Cangqing Xizing. Taoist Yi Han showed a serious expression for the first time. "Azure Sage." He said to Ancestor Yao Han, "Thank you for telling me, fellow Taoist. However, I must obtain this matter. Once I have made the necessary preparations, I will come to you again. I hope you will not refuse then." Chapter 1961. Taoist Yu Qiu watched as Yi Han left. He pondered for a moment and said, "It seems like he hasn't changed his mind. If he comes again, will you really go and help him?" Patriarch Yao Han waved his hand and said, "It's fine if he's only looking for trouble with Taoist Zhang. But now that he's involved in a battle between the treasure spirits, why should I get involved?" He was prepared to return the favor, but there was a difference in the size of the matter. If it did not benefit him much and might even bring him more trouble, he would definitely not do it. Taoist Yu Qiu agreed, "That's a wise decision." The three of them could be said to have advanced and retreated together. If Patriarch Yao Han was involved, the two of them would not be able to escape. Previously, Azure Sage had easily taken away their treasures. If Azure Sage were to appear again, they knew that they would not be his match. Taoist Yu Lu said, "This person who calls himself Yi Han seems to be very confident. The treasure spirits of creation always have some unpredictable tricks up their sleeves. Let's let him fight with Taoist Zhang for a while, and then we'll find an opportunity to act." After Zhang Yan threw the two fragments of the essence of creation into Bu Su Tian, he waved his sleeve, and a golden light shot out. It was the Tai golden bead that was sent to where Taoist Zhang Yuan was. Taoist Xinchang was unable to leave, and without anyone to guide him, his mana could not get close to that place. Therefore, he could only rely on Taoist Zhang Yuan to pass it on to him. At this moment, he thought of the inexplicable feeling from before. Nothing happened until he obtained the fragments of creation, but he did not ignore it. Something that could appear in his heart would not be that simple. Even if it did not appear in front of him, something would definitely happen in the future. Fortunately, his cultivation was improving rapidly, and he was becoming more powerful with every passing moment. The later the feeling came, the more he would be able to deal with it. He straightened his mind and continued to comprehend the Tao in Bu Su Tian. However, this time, as soon as his consciousness sank into it, he felt the truth of the grand Tao shine into his body. He immediately knew that this was caused by the two good fortune fragments. This caused him to be slightly surprised. Originally, he wouldn't waste these two items that were placed here. It was just that one or two of them weren't of much use to him right now, so he was prepared to deal with them together in the future when there were more of them. However, he didn't expect that they would take the initiative to fuse with his consciousness. If there was no accident, this was caused by Bu Su Tian. Compared to Bu Shu Tian, these two fragments were like small boats in the ocean. After they sank into this space, they could only follow the current. Thus, when his consciousness stirred Bu Shu Tian, he was also drawn into it. He thought for a moment. Although this was not a bad thing, it was best if he could control Bu Su Tian. Fortunately, regardless of whether it was Bu Shu Tian or the good fortune fragment, as long as his consciousness didn't accept it, the great Tao wouldn't shine on him. So, as long as he knew what to do, a similar situation wouldn't happen again. Fortunately, whether it was Busu Tian or the fragment of creation, as long as his consciousness did not accept it, the truth of the Tao would not shine over. Thus, as long as he knew what to do, a similar situation would not occur again. While he was thinking, the jade plate beside him suddenly emitted light. However, it only flashed for a moment before dimming again. Seeing that this was the case, he didn't pay much attention to it. After all, this thing was by his side, so whatever mysteries were hidden within it would gradually be revealed as time passed. Inside Sangqing meditation, Azure Saint was looking at the worlds to find the existence of the fragment of creation. There was nothing clever about this, and it all depended on one's luck. In fact, for a powerful being like him, if he focused all his attention on the search, he would find something after a long time. However, he was so patient now because that existence had not appeared yet. If danger came, he would not sit here and would go out to snatch it. However, at that time, even if he did not look for others, others would come looking for him. Just as his mind was wandering through the thousands of realms, suddenly, a wave of mana rushed in. Although it couldn't affect him, it made it impossible for him to clearly see the changes in each realm. It was obvious that someone was disturbing him. He could not help but have a cold expression. He calculated for a moment and snorted. Immediately, an incarnation appeared in the void and followed the mana. Soon, it came in front of a Taoist in bright clothes. The Taoist bowed to him and said, "Fellow Taoist, you are finally here." Qing Sheng was displeased. "Yi Han, what are you trying to do? I am not in the mood to deal with you now, but if you insist on making things difficult for me, I will not let you off easily." Taoist Yi Han said, "Fellow Taoist, don't be angry. I am only here to confirm one thing. If it has nothing to do with you, I will leave and not disturb you again." Azure Saint did not want to really fall out with him, so he said coldly, "What is it?" Taoist Yi Han said, "Do you know Taoist Zhang?" Hearing this, Taoist Qing Sheng stared at him and said, "Why, do you want to deal with this person?" Taoist Yi Han said, "I have no grudges with this person. Recently, I found a fellow Taoist who was restrained and I want to free him. A fellow Taoist has deduced that this Taoist Zhang may be related to this matter." Taoist Qing Sheng changed his mind and said coldly, "This person has nothing to do with me. No matter what you want to do, it has nothing to do with me. In the future, do not bother me with such things. If I see you disturbing me again, I will not be polite." Taoist Yi Han looked at him and said, "All right, I hope that fellow Taoist will not interfere. Farewell." He bowed and disappeared in a flash. Taoist Qing Sheng also changed his mind and retreated his incarnation, thinking about whether he could make use of this matter. The reason why he did not use forceful methods to snatch Busu Tian was that Zhang Yan had helpers at that time. Secondly, he was afraid that Zhang Yan would rather close Busu Tian's door than let him in. On the other hand, if Zhang Yan was fighting for it with someone else and it was only a small matter, then Qin Shi would naturally not lend a hand. However, if there was a possibility that the place that contained the essence of creation could be seized, then he would naturally not allow that to happen. As for his promise to Taoist Yi Han not to interfere, he did not take it to heart. He and Taoist Yi Han were enemies, so a few casual words did not count. After Taoist Yi Han and Azure Saint parted ways, he appeared outside of Taoist Xinchang's world of tranquility. This time, he came alone and did not try to rope in Patriarch Yao Han and the other two Taoists. This was because he could see that they had no intention of helping him. If he forced them, he might fall out with them. Even if he did not have anyone to help him, he was well prepared. He was the manifestation of a treasure spirit and was born with a treasure of good fortune. Apart from that, he had borrowed another one from his friends. With the advantage of two treasures of good fortune, he was confident that he could fight the enemy. If he couldn't, he would think of another way. At this moment, he did not have the intention to attack directly. Instead, he was secretly observing the world of tranquility, trying to find a suitable opportunity to enter. After Taoist Xinchang received the Tai Golden Pearl from Zhang Yan, he used it to strengthen the seal. This way, even if the other consciousness had a higher cultivation than him, it would not be able to break free. Fortunately, not long after, he relaxed. Although the other consciousness's cultivation was still improving, it was far from its previous momentum. Moreover, it was gradually slowing down. If this continued, it would become stagnant sooner or later. He pondered and said, "It seems that Taoist Zhang's judgment is correct. That person's cultivation must have improved because he swallowed the precious embryo. Now, he is almost exhausted." This was good news for him. For those who sought external help, the improvement of their attainment almost had to rely on the essence of creation. However, he had achieved the path of seeking himself. As long as he poured his will into the body, his attainment would be improved. While the other consciousness was stagnant, he could slowly improve. If this continued, it would not take long before his attainment would surpass the other consciousness. As he expected, because Xinchang Boy's cultivation was higher and he had occupied the body for a longer time, Taoist Zhan Yuan could only use the power of the seal to balance it. However, as his cultivation improved, the situation gradually reversed. Taoist Zhan Yuan was now in charge of protecting him. Whenever Xinchang Boy appeared, he would come to take charge. Seeing this, Taoist Zhan Yuan felt much more at ease. However, after the two consciousnesses alternated dozens of times, Taoist Zhan Yuan came again, but his expression changed slightly. He saw Xinchang Boy standing there, looking up at Su Ji. Taoist Zhan Yuan's heart sank. Logically speaking, it was not time yet, but this person had appeared. It was hard to know if something had happened. He asked tentatively, "What are you looking at?" Xinchang Boy bit his finger and stared up. "That person is here." Taoist Zhan Yuan frowned and asked, "Who?" Xinchang Boy said, "The person I called last time." Taoist Zhan Yuan was shocked. If what Xinchang Boy said was true, that the enemy was already in front of his door, but he had not felt anything until now, then the enemy must have used some method to conceal himself. He immediately took out a spell. This was a backup plan left behind by the Xinchang Taoist. He could use the power of the seal to suppress the consciousness of the Xinchang Taoist. Then, the Xinchang Taoist's consciousness would come out and he would be able to fight his enemy freely. But after he did this, he suddenly found that it was useless. Xinchang Boy was still standing there. Taoist Zhan Yuan had a bad feeling. Before he could think of another way, a red ray of light shot in from outside and landed on the world stopper. Instantly, an entrance was forcibly torn open in this space. Then, a majestic spiritual power invaded inside. Zhang Yan was in the middle of the dingshi when he suddenly sensed that something was wrong outside. He sensed that Taoist Zhan Yuan's magic power had suddenly fluctuated violently, which meant that he was fighting with someone. Zhang Yan immediately opened his eyes and looked around. He saw a Taoist in splendid clothes rushing to Xinchang Boy's dingshi. Taoist Zhan Yuan was confronting him with a golden bell in his hand. With a shake of the bell, Xinchang Boy's magic power weakened a little. Taoist Zhan Yuan's magic power was obviously higher, but under the influence of the bell, his magic power was constantly weakened. It seemed that he would not be able to hold on for long.